Everybody on this call right now is a regular. Oh, wait, here comes Barbara. Excellent. Hi, Barbara. Welcome to the call. We're just getting started. We were just talking about people's vacations, so you haven't missed anything. So I'm just going to paste into the chat our kickoff here. This is a week 172 of medieval civilization in the week 172 of the Millennia and Microcosm segment of the Kenneth Smith seminar. We're continuing our increasingly deep dive into medieval civilization, in which we're augmenting Kenneth's text, where he's exploring medieval civilization and its worldview. We're augmenting that with, original biblical, canonical, and extra-canonical texts to try to kind of support what he's doing, which is to try to get us competent to immerse ourselves fully into the medieval worldview. Not because it's right and we're wrong and we want to replace the modern worldview with the medieval. Kenneth, as an existentialist philosopher, doesn't believe any single human perspective is the right perspective, and that we shouldn't remain slaves of the perspective we were born into. It's our philosophical duty to immerse ourselves in enough other really radically alien worldviews until we learn how to do justice to them, to get to the point where we're capable of switching back and forth between worldviews, something that does not come naturally to human being, but that we can cultivate in ourselves as a capability. This book, Millennia Microcosm, takes us through three worldviews: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. And we're going to talk about the ancient some today. I had a bunch of insights I picked up in the last several days, and contrast it with the medieval. Anyway, those three worldviews, partially so that we get into two alien worldviews, because the ancients saw the world very differently than we do. The medieval saw the world very differently than we do and very differently than the ancients do. And partially to come back and look at the modern worldview after that with new eyes, so that we're capable of stepping outside the modern worldview and seeing it for closer to what it is rather than for what it imagines itself to be. I should say what it flatters itself to be, because flattery is really core to the modern worldview. It's why it calls itself modern. The implication is everybody else is obsolete. We're the best. We're the newest. We're the shiniest. Everybody else is stupid. So Kenneth hopes that by the time we finish this exercise with this book, which we're 3.5 years and counting through, we'll be in a position where we could go out into the world and encounter other alien worldviews, and instead of fighting them or rejecting them or mocking them, we could respond with great interest and curiosity and say, I wonder what they see that my current collection of three worldviews can't see. I need to dig in and find out, and then I can expand my toolbox of perspectives on the world. That's the project of the book. A medieval civilization. Doing this deep dive on medieval civilization is a bit contrary, because this is the one moderns don't respect. We respect the ancients as supposedly primitive versions of ourselves. We praise them for everything that makes it look like we're looking in a mirror with them. We say, "Oh, look at you! You have democracy. How glorious! You must be advanced because you're like us." "Oh, hey, you've got philosophy and science. That's great. How glorious for you because you're like us a little bit. So that makes you cool." But we define ourselves in opposition to medieval civilization. We say that's the Dark Ages. We're the Age of Enlightenment. They're the Dark Ages. They suck and we rock. And as a result, most people who studied philosophy and history and politics and economics, they might do some time on medieval, but the big focus, especially in philosophy, is ancient and modern, and just sort of skip over 1,000 years of medieval history, which is a shame because, as Kenneth points out, there is a coherent set of worldviews in there in medieval civilization that can offer perspective and counterpoint to the other two. So it's a little perverse what we're doing by taking them seriously. And in this second year of our time on the medieval civilization, I'm increasing the perversity by augmenting Kenneth's text with these additional texts. We started out by augmenting with the Gospel according to Thomas, which of course is not a gospel at all. It's a sayings document. And we spent the last 3 weeks doing a deep dive on Q, which is abbreviation for the German word Quelle, which means source, which is based on the premise that Matthew and Luke had two sources in front of them when they were writing their own gospels. And one of those sources was Mark, which we have, and the other source was something that we don't have, and which for 150 years philologists have been doing textual analysis to try to reconstruct what must have been in Q that resulted in the parts of Matthew and Luke that are in common, but that they don't share with Mark. And that's what Q is. Today, we're going to turn from a deep dive in the Q text. We're going to turn to the context of Q. What led to its creation? What does it tell us about early Christianity? Especially, what does it tell us about early Christianity that's radically different from what most of us believe early Christianity to have been like? How can it open up? How can it dislodge our catechisms and assumptions and ideologies and allow us to look more, I hesitate to use the word objectively, at the evidence that we have available to suggest what early Christianity might have been. And so we're going to do some of that, and we're going to open with an investigation of epistemology. How do we know things? What are the hazards of human beings trying to know things? Because you can't grapple with people's most beloved religious ideas without confronting the problems of human epistemology. So we're going to dig into that first. Then we'll spend some time with doing context and Q, and then we'll turn to some paragraphs from sorry, it should say paragraph 19 to 20, not 18 to 20. I didn't fix that. I'm gonna fix that right now while I'm talking. Anyway, then we'll turn to paragraphs 19 and 20 of chapter 8 in Kenneth's book, which as you'll see, everything that we've talked about before today, in the first 2 hours of today, will act as a counterpoint and a foundation for what he's talking about. All we're really doing is engaging in an exercise Kenneth Smith himself wants us to engage in. He doesn't write like a guru who wants to be followed. He writes like a philosophy professor who's constantly pointing the finger to other writers, artists, other philosophers, and so on. He wants us to go out and explore the world of ideas, to engage in this great conversation. And so that's what we're doing in this seminar. We're sort of exploring things that might end up in footnotes in the final book once we publish it. As usual, David Royal has given us a nice summary of the material in Kenneth that we're going to go through. He said, and I'll just recite it for those who don't have the chat handy, like such as those on the live stream or watching the YouTube videos. He says, Kenneth Smith argues that the church spread Christianity by appealing to humanity's lowest motives, fear, conformity, and desire for reward, thereby corrupting genuine spiritual values into a system of psychological control rooted in punishment and promise rather than intrinsic goodness. He contends that the doctrines of heaven and hell debased spirituality itself, replacing love, awe, and moral intelligence with crude conditioning that reshaped religion into an amoral mechanism of behavioral manipulation. And of course, this is one of the major themes of chapter 8. He's been building the case, in paragraphs 1 through 18 to get us to the point where we're at in the discussion. And we'll pick that up in the second half of today. For today, just a reminder that for Q, we're using Burton Mack's The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins, which any of you could go pick up on Amazon or somewhere else. It's an excellent book. It introduces you to Galilee and Judea and Idumea and Samaria at the time of Jesus, and what was going on in that world. What was it like for them? And it's full of surprises, like, for example, the discussion of the fact that although in hindsight we tend to read that time as that must be Israel, all of it together must be Israel, and they must be Jews who go to the temple and they have rabbis and they all speak Hebrew, and we have this set of assumptions, and Burton Mack really breaks that up and says there's no archaeological evidence that's true. There is Judea towards the south, between Idumea, which is south of it, and Samaria, which is north of it. And Judea is not unlike our assumptions about this area. But Idumea is different. Samaria is different. Palestine along the coast, Syria, the Decapolis, they're all different. And Galilee especially is different. And one of the ways in which all of this is different than the way we expect is all of this was conquered by Alexander the Great. He Hellenized the whole place, all the way to the borders of India. It became like a great extension of Greece. I mean, he's building policies all over the place with their theaters and their and their sporting arenas and their philosophers, including wandering cynics, following the example of Diogenes and playing practical jokes on the crowd, trying to get people to shake up their assumptions and think about the possibilities for life beyond the status quo. There's all this Hellenization, and the result is a lot of these people don't speak Hebrew at all. They speak Greek. And worse, as we're going to talk about today, Alexander the Great really smashed the old temple state system of Southwest Asia, which had been functioning for 3,000 years before he broke it. And so there are all these people swirling around whose cultures have been working for them for a long time. They have a lot of momentum and power and depth, and yet they have been uprooted. Their political economies are gone, replaced with these Hellenistic city-states. And the Hellenistic city-states themselves have also been corrupted by Alexander the Great and his successors. They've been, instead of a tool for self-emancipation, which is what they were originally, as we'll talk about today, they are turned into tools of empire. There's Alexander the Great and his Ptolemaic successors and the Seleucids who took over after the Ptolemies. They are setting up new city-states side by side with the old temple cities, and then they're sucking the life out of those temple cities. They're being used as tools of conquest, and on top of that, they're giving the franchise only to the new colonial invaders and not to the people who are native to the region. So there are all these people who are being politically disenfranchised all across the Middle East. They're Hellenized and yet not Hellenized, and a lot of them are disrupted and being shoved from place to place. Hi, Ginny. A lot of them are disrupted and being shoved from place to place, and so you've got people speaking Aramaic in places that were never part of an empire where Aramaic was spoken. You got people speaking Greek in places where it was never part of a place where Greek was spoken. Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew. You've got Persian languages. You've got all of these different things are swirling around in sort of a involuntarily cosmopolitanized blender. And now these people are trying to figure out who the hell am I and how are we supposed to run our lives. It is a time of cultural ferment. It is not an insular, monotheistic, monocultural, monogenetic country at all. It is a number of separate countries under separate rulers. So we'll come to this in a moment. So this is he talks about this some in the Lost Gospel, the Book of Q, and then he talks about what is the state of the art with the theories about Q. I've also listed a second book down below, which is the one I started reading this morning. That's Burton Mack's Who Wrote the New Testament. And that's his more general book, less about Q and more about where did the New Testament come from. And it applies to the same period that we're talking through. So anyone who wants to pick up a copy of that and start reading, it's very, very readable. And his goal in that is not to make an argument about his personal theory. His goal in Who Wrote the New Testament is to solve a problem that biblical scholars have today. The problem they have is that although there's some disagreement, of course, on anything this volatile, there has to be. It says, in general, there is a broad consensus among Bible scholars about all kinds of things that the public has no idea about. Like the fact that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were not written by Mark or Matthew or Luke or John. They couldn't have been. And it's to the point where someone can be a devout Christian Bible scholar and still fully accept that Mark didn't write Mark and John didn't write John and so on. I mean, he's saying these things have that level of consensus. But when you go into churches or you just start, interviewing people on the street, everyone seems to think that they were written by those four people. He says, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's an enormous mass of scholarship now about the structure of the New Testament and where it came from and what it tells us about early Christianity and what disagreements did they have and what points of agreement. That is widely agreed upon by Bible scholars and almost entirely unknown in modern Christian churches or in the public. So his goal in Who Wrote the New Testament is only to bring the public up to date with kind of where the consensus is in Bible scholarship. It's to try to bridge that gap. And we'll be assuming a lot of that material, and we'll talk about it some too over the course of the next year as we as we dig into the medieval era. Um, because to understand the medieval era, we need to understand how it actually arose, not how we imagine or fantasize that it arose. And the difference is enormous. It's enormous. Is the medieval period, does the medieval period exist in order for us to kick it around and say how stupid they were and how smart we are? Or does it exist because it had to arise from the forces of history, because of the struggles that were happening, during the corrupt late Roman Empire? And the answer, how you characterize the period and understand it, is dramatically different if you take one approach versus the other. So we're trying for the existentialist approach. What actually happened? Why did these things actually occur? And that means we're going to have to confront a lot of our assumptions, a lot of our common knowledge. Ginny, tell us what's on your mind.
So maybe are you talking about one particular area like Italy versus England area, or are you talking about medieval all over Europe? Um,
When I say medieval,
yeah, you say not as we imagined it, but what actually happened. Are you talking about particular area, or are you talking about all of Europe? Like I'm thinking, when I think of medieval period, I think of England, for example,
yeah,
which may be different from Italy area, as we know it, Roman Italy, Rome.
that's a
So
great question.
yeah, I'm just wondering if you were, because I would think
The
that
whole thing.
the way one area that thought of it and handled, conceived and the medieval period may be different from another area,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
So we're going to talk about the whole thing. We're
Okay.
going to talk
Oh,
about the whole
okay.
thing. And it doesn't include the whole world, despite the fact that the medieval powers that be wanted to impose their religious empire on the whole world, but they lacked the technology and organization to do it. And so the most that they could do was Europe itself. And they attempted to impose themselves on the Holy Land, as we know, in the Crusades. But as we'll discover, that didn't go very well for them. So, despite enormous loss of life and inflicting enormous loss of life on the people they fought, those Crusader kingdoms collapsed pretty quickly. They didn't last very long. So we are limiting ourselves to Europe here, and part of the reason we're doing that is that the medieval epoch, um, was the birthplace of the modern epoch, and the modern epoch imposed itself on the whole world. So if we want to understand why did modernity globalize the way that it did, we have to really understand the mindset of the medieval world order, which we inherited. We're basically medievals with a few changes, uh, although we hate to think of ourselves that way. And that's why we think it's appropriate for us to impose our ways on the entire world. That's what the medievals wanted to do. We inherited that goal from them. Now, I would really like to talk about medieval China, medieval India, medieval Japan, medieval Africa. I want to talk about some of these other medievalisms, but and maybe we will, but we won't early on because it's all I can do to try to keep up with the studying I'm having to do to pull together the pieces for just medieval Europe. So we'll see where we are when we get to the end of the medieval Europe arc, and maybe we can maybe we can dive into some of the others as well. As I've alluded to in previous talks, despite the fact that medieval China, medieval India, medieval Japan, medieval Africa arose from completely different circumstances than medieval Europe did, there's just no question. It was very different. Weirdly, they converge on the same kinds of worldview in a lot of ways. It's kind of shocking, and I don't mean identical, but the mandate of heaven in China is very very close to the divine right of kings in Europe, despite the fact that they came up with it independently. I mean, for completely different reasons. And the divine right of kings in Europe is informed by Christianity, whereas the mandate of heaven has to do with Confucianism and legalism and Moism and Taoism and Buddhism and all these other things, right? That led into that. And yet they arrive in the same place in a way, despite the differences. That idea of the alignment of politics and religion, it's very interesting. And we'll talk about why a little bit today. So great question, Jeannie. Thanks. So, okay, so these are the books that I'm using as background. In the early chapters of the Lost Gospel, Burton Mack gives you the background of 150 years of biblical scholarship. Who were the main movers and shakers? What were the main movements? I don't. Stephen's not here today, but he was talking about apocalyptic Christianity and the idea of Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher. In the Lost Gospel, they cover that how that movement arose at the end of the 19th century as an interpretation of Jesus, how and why, what its influence was, and so on. And you hear that when Stephen's talking about this. And then in Who Wrote the New Testament, which I'm only a little ways into, likewise, he's giving us some of the history of the region, Galilee and Judea and so forth. So, but let's start with epistemology. We're a half hour in. We finished our intro. It's time to dig in and do a little core philosophy, and this is to deal with the question of, we're talking about difficult issues that people have a hard time questioning. Most of our religions today don't encourage skepticism about the religion. That's not a core part of the kinds of religions that are popular in the world today. It's not to say that it's inherent in religion. It's not to say religion can't be self-critical. It's to say the ones that dominate right now are really very not. They're big about criticizing others. They'll tell you the other religions are wrong, but they themselves usually argue that they have a strong fidelity to the truth. And 9 times out of 10, the core reason that they explain is because they have God whispering in there to tell them what the truth is, whether it's through prayer, whether it's from listening to a pope, whether it's from studying Holy Scripture. There's a lot of rationalizations that people give for this, but their basic argument is, you can't question me because I speak for God. I know what God wants. I know what God thinks, and this is what it is. And so therefore, if you question me, you're questioning God. So therefore, no part of what I say can be questioned. And this is the argument I'm going to make today, is from an existentialist philosophical position. This is an extraordinarily dangerous thing for a human being to do. It's extraordinarily dangerous because human beings, to err is human. I mean, haven't we all heard that? And don't we know it from our own lives? To err is human. It is natural to be wrong about things. And as we spent a bunch of time talking about in this seminar over the last 3 years, it is an inescapable result of the human condition. We live in a vast cosmos that's unbelievably complex. Most of it we're never even going to see, let alone visit. We don't really know what's going on there. We can generalize about laws of nature like gravity that probably apply the same ways in all places. But knowing the laws of gravity doesn't tell you whether some paper hanger in Austria is going to end up starting, a Holocaust. The laws of physics don't help you to get to the details of what's happening and why. They just help to frame it in a little bit. So, it is an inescapable part of the human condition that because we are in such a small area, well, not all Christianity is religious fascism. There's particular kinds of Christianity that are religious fascism. Other kinds are ecumenical and interfaith, which is the opposite. But we'll go back to that. So it's possible to build a religion around the core observation that human beings are wrong a lot, and we have to be very careful with what we try to say about the world, especially when we speak in absolutes. The Greeks did a lot of that. Their religion was all about polytheism, which is the idea that there's multiple gods. And it was not an orthodox polytheism. It was here are the basics, and we assume that we're missing a bunch. And anytime we encounter a new religion, we study it to figure out which of their gods are pretty much the same as ours, and which gods do they have that we're missing. And oh my God, we're missing a god. We're in trouble. We have to learn from these people. What is this sacred thing that you've discovered that we missed? And maybe the fact that we were missing it would explain ways in which we've gone wrong in our own history. We need to learn from you. This is the opposite of religious genocide. This idea of not just religious tolerance, not even just religious curiosity, but what we might call a science of religion. They empirically want to go out into the world and find all the gods. It's like we're medieval. Our background in medievalism doesn't prepare us to understand that there could be a religion like that. So it's possible for religions to operate differently than the ones that we have now. But we're stuck in this kind of dogmatic period. And To be dogmatic about one's own ideas is very much like being a practicing alcoholic. Alcoholics fall into two camps: the ones who are practicing and the ones who are not practicing. I'm a non-practicing alcoholic. Never been drunk in my life. I don't drink. And I don't drink because every adult member of my family, going back for multiple generations on all sides, has spent significant amount of their lives in the bottle, unable to get out. So I don't need to run that test. I obviously have the genes. I get it from both sides. Um, and what you discover is if you grow up around people who are practicing alcoholics, they always have an endless array of excuses and explanations and reasons why they're not actually alcoholics, despite the fact that they drink all the time. And one of the core arguments is the paradoxical argument: because I can hold my liquor, I'm not an alcoholic, says the alcoholic. They say only people who can't hold their liquor are alcoholics. And so what they're saying is they're pointing to the vast amounts of alcohol that they can put through their bodies as evidence that they're not an alcoholic, which, it's what's called circular reasoning. The very thing that is the problem they're pointing to as the virtue. So this is how it is with dogmatism. For a human being to be dogmatic is to say, okay, here we have a species that has a real problem trying to understand the truth. Right? We always only have a tiny piece of the picture. Welcome to the call, Celine. We're talking about epistemology as a warm up to talking about medieval civilization. So Homo sapiens is a species that has a problem with honesty and the truth, because we live parochial lives. We only live a short time. We live in a small area. You can be the most cosmopolitan person who ever lived and visit every country on Earth, and you're still parochial because Earth is a tiny dot in a vast cosmos. Most of what's happening, we never even lay our eyes on, right? So we're going to have errors in our understanding of the world. And any civilization or belief system should build upon that so that it is adaptable and flexible and capable of learning from its own mistakes. When we get into trouble is when we get dogmatic and say, I'm not a human being. I am the voice of God. I am the voice of Scripture. I have perfection. I am inerrant. And when we start saying those things, we set ourselves up for trouble. Um, there's a there's a there's a there's a there's a distinction I'd like us to draw when we're talking about epistemology between honesty, deception, orthodoxy, candidness, and truth seeking. And in English, we have many of these terms confused with each other. For many people, the truth is the orthodox position that you've been taught. And if you repeat back perfectly the orthodoxy that's been drilled into you, then you're telling the truth. You see this especially with people who capitalize truth. I convey the truth, by which they mean I have no interest whatsoever in empirically investigating where I'm wrong. I have memorized a catechism and I'm certain it is right, and I won't allow it to be questioned. But they call that truth. There's confusion, and English doesn't help this matter. We can all sort of imagine the idea of deception as being not a good thing, and we can imagine self-deception as being a bad thing, but usually we are unwilling to acknowledge that we self-deceive. It's other people who we think self-deceive, especially people who disagree with us. We point to them as examples of self-deception, and we point to ourselves as examples of not deceiving ourselves. And in doing that, we're deceiving ourselves. Of course, we engage in self-deception. It's native to Homo sapiens to self-deceive. And one of the key examples of that is the problem with the word honesty. We in English, we talk about honesty like it's a virtue, but we're not exactly sure what we mean by honesty. So I'd like to distinguish candidness from truth seeking. What most people mean by honesty is I said what I really think. I did not set out to deceive you. I authentically regurgitated whatever is in my head, and that makes me honest. The problem with that definition is that is a kind of honesty that has almost nothing to do with the truth. It's about authenticity. You're being your authentic self, but whether something's true is completely separate from whether I believe it or not. This is core to existentialism, right? Existentialism says we have to go out into the world and find out what's real. We can't just assume we've got it because, we make mistakes. To be truth seeking, we have to take responsibility for the things that we think that are false. We can't just say, I regurgitated all the falsehoods that I earnestly believe, and that counts as the truth, right? Because if I believe, I'll give you an example from evolution. I had this wrong for decades in my youth. I used to say ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. You guys heard that one? Ontogeny recapitulates. I'm going to just type it in here. It's such an important concept from the history of the science of evolution. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And this was believed for a while as being fundamental to the nature of Homo sapiens. And it has since been refuted, but people to this day still say it. I said it 20 years ago and I believed it. I was full of crap, but I believed it. So what are we talking about? Phylogeny is the development of new species over time. Phylum, kingdom, phylum, class. King Philip came over for Greek soup is the mnemonic, right? There's all these different categories of relationships among living organisms, and they developed over time through variation and evolution. And the process by which Homo sapiens developed from fish, for example, which we might shorthand by calling evolution, more specifically is called phylogeny. How did our category of beings come into the world through a series of changes from some earlier category of beings? That's what phylogeny is. Ontogeny is about how you go from being a fertilized egg to an adult. How do you gestate? How do your limbs come into being? How does your spinal cord come into being? The egg doesn't have a spinal cord. The spinal cord is made of lots of cells, and the egg's a single cell. It can't have the body parts hidden within it somewhere. It's the process by which it divides, and its divisions begin to specialize, and then you get folding and budding and all kinds of interesting things going on that results in the generation of an embryo and a human being. That's ontogeny. And for a long time, it was believed that the process an embryo goes through in transforming from an egg to an adult human being recapitulated the stages of evolution. We said, oh, there's a stage where you have gills like a fish, and then there's a stage where you have webbed hands like an amphibian, and then there's a stage where we imagined a reptile stage, and we just imagined all these stages occurring. But we were wrong. We were totally wrong about that. There are some suggestive metaphorical parallels for sure. All kinds of interesting things happen in the development of an adult human being, but it's not a recapitulation of evolution. It doesn't have to be, because the thing that the biologists got wrong when they said ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is that when we evolved as a species, our gestation processes also evolved. They changed too. They didn't just add things to the end. They changed the steps along the way. The way that an egg turns into an adult human being is unique to Homo sapiens. It veers near and away from what some other species do at various points, but it is its own path. It's its own life way, and it is every bit as evolved as anything else about us. So this is an example of something that I taught many people. God help me. I've been an evolutionary biologist enthusiast since I was before first grade. And I've taught many people that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is bullshit. And I could spend the rest of my life trying to chase down all those people I misinformed, and I would never find them all. I mean, some of them died. They went to their grave believing my bullshit, right? I was candid with them. I did not set out to deceive them, but I did not tell the truth, did I? Because it is not the truth that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. We know that now. We could cite hundreds or thousands of examples that disprove this old mantra, but I didn't know them at the time. And thanks to me, lots of other people don't know them either. I'm helping, right? Was that honest of me? Well, it depends. Does honesty mean I told the truth or that I was candid? If I was candid, I only told what I thought was the truth, which is not the truth, which means I was dishonest unintentionally, right? Because I didn't convey the actual truth. Whereas if I were lying, I would be dishonest intentionally. But if all honesty means is candidness, then honesty can't be a virtue. Just blathering out whatever's in your head, that's not actually bringing people closer to the truth. Because now you're spreading the infectious bullshit that persuaded you, and now it's going to persuade others. And next thing you know, you've got dozens of people running around the world thinking ontogeny, recapitulated phylogeny, and it's your fault. You did that to them, right? You made things worse for them. So we have problems. This is what existentialist philosophy has to say about the truth. We have problems on the issues of honesty and truth seeking and deception versus self deception. And did I recite the orthodoxy? Did I recite what I believed? Or did I actually search for the truth and let people know, hey, this is not my area. I don't actually know this very well. Maybe you should consult someone who knows better. Or maybe we should go find out for ourselves. Let's go out in the woods and see what a bear does in the woods. And maybe looking for ourselves is the easiest way to find out rather than me opinionating out of my chair. These issues of honesty are very complicated for people, right? They're very complicated for us. The fact that we believe something doesn't remotely mean that it's true. So Homo sapiens in general, and I'm walking us through the next step here, is not objective and not capable of being objective. To be objective is to think and speak in alignment with the actual truth of reality. But we can't do that because we only ever get little bits of reality. We get little aspectival perspectives on reality, which is what Kenneth Smith's up to in this book, is trying to teach us to want more than one perspective. And as long as we're only looking from a certain angle, we're going to see some things and miss other things. We're going to understand some things and misunderstand other things. It is inherent in the human condition. And so when people claim to be objective, first of all, that's a lie. There might be a lie they believe. I mean, they might be being candid, but it's at least an untruth. And in fact, if it's an untruth that they believe to the bottom of their heart, that's worse. I mean, if they were lying, you could at least dislodge them and say, ha ha, I know you're lying. Let's look for the truth together. But if they believe to the bottom of their being that they're a prophet of truth, an angel of reason, and that they're just an oracle who opens his mouth and reality comes out, then they're deluded beyond most people who are deluded. It would be better if they were locked up in an asylum thinking that they were Napoleon. Because if you think you're a prophet of the truth, you think you're a god, right? You think that to err is not human. That's something that you don't do. So we have, so I talked about one of the problems here is the parochialism. We are fundamentally parochial creatures. We don't live long enough to be anything else. We don't travel faster than the speed of light. We can't go see what it looks like on Alpha Centauri. We're not able to do that. I mean, I can't even tell you what it looks like at Paris today. And this is how you can end up in that situation we were in the United States in 2020 and 2021, where all kinds of people in rural America were absolutely convinced the cities were on fire. Crazy people were rioting and burning down the cities, and we had to send in the army to stop the violence. I had some friends in small towns, and they were putting this stuff on Facebook. And I said, I could let me take my camera outside. This is the city of Seattle. Do you see any fires? I don't see any fires. And what they did is they just stopped. They dropped the thread and went somewhere else. They went somewhere where they could say that same thing and not be confronted by the evidence that they were wrong. So even when we could travel to some place to investigate the truth, so often we don't. We get comfortable with the things that we believe, and then we kind of want to protect. We want to protect that comfort by avoiding things that would dislodge the comfortable idea. And in its extreme form, this leads to the second major problem with Homo sapiens that prevents us from being objective. And that is far worse than an addiction to heroin or to nicotine. We are addicted to confidence. That as a species, we love to feel like we have a handle on things. I mean, I love that feeling. I know I love it. And everybody I've talked to shows plenty of evidence of loving it. We like it when we feel like we understand something and know what's what. When we know who you can trust and who you can't. When we know what foods are good to eat, when we know that you can treat a disease, by taking aspirin or horse tranquilizers. We love the feeling of being in the know. And the problem is, for a species that is never completely in the know, that is a very dangerous thing to crave, that feeling. And what it leads to is it leads us into the exact situation that Heraclitus warned us about, didn't he? He said, what did he say about this? He said, character is fate, ethos anthropoi daimon. How we see the world, how we interpret the world, what we think is true or not true, how we decide what to believe and what not to believe is not ultimately decided according to the laws of truth or reason. They're decided by our character. Each of us has a slightly different character that wants different things and wants to avoid other things. And when we look out into the world, the things that are most juicy and charged for us stand out, and we notice them and care about them. And the things that we've been taught not to care about, they just fade away into the background. And thus, for a human being, the act of looking at the world is a little bit like looking at a Rorschach test. A Rorschach test. We project onto it what we want it to be. That's what we do with early Bible history. When we're talking about the history of early Christianity, that first 100, 200, 300 years, the evidence we are going to give a lot of credence to versus the evidence that we're going to ignore as not persuasive isn't determined by the truth of what happened. So none of us were there. We don't know what the hell happened. It's determined by our character. Our character says what matters to us. Which beliefs do we need to protect and defend and reinforce and find evidence for and prove? Right? Our obsession with proving things and finding evidence for things is the confidence addiction equivalent of the alcoholic's need to prove that he's not an alcoholic. Right? Look how I can hold my liquor. That's what it's like when we run around and cherry pick the evidence and pull back big mountains of evidence that are nevertheless selective and that exclude all the things that would have made us or made somebody else question what we believe. So the whole theme of this book, Millennia Microcosm, is Kenneth Smith is exploring the existentialist critique of the widespread and really dominant default inability of Homo sapiens to separate ourselves from our worldview. We invest in our worldview so strongly, you would think they matter more than we do. Well, many people will give their lives for their worldview to protect it from being dislodged. And that's a spectacularly dangerous thing to do when human beings are making a whole bunch of mistakes with their worldviews all the time. We're defending our errors and fighting one another for who has to admit they made a mistake and who gets to avoid admitting they made a mistake. And all this puts us in a situation where we need to make a distinction, which is sophistry versus philosophy. Sophistry versus philosophy. If you learn all these debating techniques and methods for picking apart a bad argument, and then you use them against other people's arguments, but never against your own, you're not a philosopher. You're a sophist. Right? Donald knows, right? This is what the sophists taught in ancient Athens. They taught you how to win the argument, how to make the lesser appear to be the greater, how to make the greater appear to be the lesser. This was the accusation against them. These people could care less what's real. They just want to win. Right? I mean, and Plato has a go at them. and he describes Socrates having a go at them. And other writers of ancient Greece have a go at them. This is sophistry, say the Athenians, is ruining Athens. It's killing us because now we can't have a coherent political debate about what the right thing is to do without a bunch of sophists weighing in. And they're armed to the teeth with the tools of rhetoric, but they're not wielding them for the sake of health. They're not wielding them with sophrosune, as Aristotle would say. They're just wielding them to win, even if that makes us all sick. Even if the result is Athens throws together the largest fleet that ever existed and sails off to Syracuse and loses everything and loses the Peloponnesian War and ends up being a vassal state of the Spartans. Still, the need to win the arguments and distort the arguments, the need to be confident in the positions that they were saying was so great that they wrecked themselves. It is in a sense the Achilles heel of a polis. If a polis is governed through persuasion and rational debate, the Achilles heel is what happens when you get trolls in there. Especially what if you get sophisticated, subtle trolls who know how to appear like an Aristos while actually pursuing Banausic or, God help us, Dulic ends based on such motivations. So there are a couple of we're almost done with this part, this little lead in on epistemology. There are a couple of things here. So that I just want to hit before we wrap up and turn to the early Christian history, which is kind of my main meat for today. One is when we investigate a subject, we have to learn to be skeptical about ourselves, right? I mean, this is what Kafka says when he says he was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint only on the condition that he use it against himself. This isn't just a typical Kafkaesque, oh, well, what a bummer. That would be a shitty situation to be in. This is the definition of philosophy. When you wield the tools of textual analysis and rhetoric against your own dogmas, then it is an act of liberation. Because you can dislodge yourself from the bullshit that you believe that's been trapping you. You can help to break your own shackles. You can help to get yourself a little bit out of the labyrinth that you've spent your whole life building mentally for yourself, that you're trapped in, which is your worldview and the way that you justify it to yourself. But if we wield those tools instead to defend our bullshit, rather than to acknowledge that there is any bullshit in there, then instead of empirical investigation, it becomes rationalization. And rationalization, if you're not careful about it, can look a whole lot like empirical investigation. You can use the same terminology, you can use the same techniques, but the giveaway is that you're only ever wielding it against other people and their arguments, the ones you don't like. That's the clue. Who benefits from this? And if the benefit is your own current set of beliefs, it ain't philosophy. Philosophy's got to be an act of liberation. Okay, so a couple of terms that I want to make sure everybody's got before we dive into this tricky stuff. The first one is euhemerize, euhemerize or euhemerization. To euhemerize is to take a mythological or fictional story and come up with a rational explanation for how it could be real. So in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a fad in science fiction writing where they would try to create worlds and scenarios that had magic or dragons or beings that seemed like gods, but then try to use science to explain how it actually was possible. So you get Marion Zimmer Bradley with her medieval kingdoms with psychic people in them, and she tries to explain psionics as being a tangible thing that could actually happen. You get the Pern series from Anne McCaffrey, in which, hey, there are dragons and they breathe fire, but it's all scientific, right? They're euhemerizing. And so whether it's magic or dragons or what have you, and people do euhemerization all the time. An example is we know Hippocrates was a real person. We have a lot of information about Hippocrates, but there was an early divine figure, a god of medicine in the ancient Greeks. And there's no reason to think he was a real person. He's a mythological person like Hercules or Zeus. But during the Alexandrian period, writers began to euhemerize him and try to come up with a life of that guy. And maybe he was actually this guy who lived in this town somewhere. And he did these things. And maybe this is why everybody thinks that he's a god. And later on, they decided he was a god. But what they've done is they've taken a fictional story and make it even more plausible by filling in biographical details that were never present in the original story. That's euhemerizing. People do it all the damn time. You see it, for example, with Star Wars fans. They watch the first Star Wars and they have a great time, and then they start thinking about some of the science involved, because Star Wars isn't really science fiction, it's science fantasy, right? It's knights with swords, right? And fighting against, and a dark knight, all of this stuff is actually fantasy in a sci-fi context. But you get people who are so excited about it that having enjoyed it, they now need to rationalize it. And so they go back and try to invent lightsabers and try to think about what could the force be in terms of science. And they're trying to shore up or rationalize or justify the original fantasy so that as they grow up, they stop being children, they grow up, they learn more science. Now they need the story to grow up and have more science in it to satisfy their changed sensibilities. That's euhemerize. The converse of euhemerize is supernaturalize. Supernaturalize. And this is one of the arguments Burton Mack makes. Based on the evidence of Q, he says the earliest evidence we have about Jesus is that he was a teacher and that that's what everyone thought he was. That early on, nobody thought he was the Savior. No one thought he died and was resurrected. No one thought he did miracles. He was a teacher. He passed on these wise sayings originally. This is his argument. He says, but by looking at Q, by looking at Paul's epistles, by looking at the development of Mark and John and these other documents, you can see how over the course of the following century, that wasn't satisfying enough. They wanted more converts, they wanted more people to join them, they needed more exciting stories, and they began adding details to the life of Jesus to supernaturalize him until, first he's just a teacher, then he becomes the son of man and the child of wisdom, then he becomes the heir, the adopted heir of the Old Testament God, then he becomes the son of the Old Testament God, then he becomes the new God, the Lord, who takes over from the Old Testament God. And Burton Mack traces, decade by decade, the steps by which Jesus got supernaturalized until by the time you get to the canon being pulled together in the New Testament, he ends up being the most powerful being in the cosmos, which is a far cry from the original wisdom teacher. But it's something people do when they're telling stories. Um, if you've ever had a favorite fantasy or science fiction series that you followed, or superhero comic book series, it is not uncommon for it to start out with somebody who's very, very human and they just have some gift or ability. And the early stories really focus to try to draw you in and get audience identification. They really try to focus on, like with Spider-Man, he's just an ordinary teenager. He's got ordinary teenage problems. He's late to class. He got a bad grade. Maybe that girl doesn't like him. I mean, it really focuses on the biography of Peter Parker in the early stories because they want you to imagine, what if that was me? They can't do that if it comes out of the gate saying Peter Parker is a god who strides across the cosmos. It's like, well, I can't relate to that. But if he's just this teenage boy who gets this gift, that's interesting. But what happens over time? Well, with all of these stories, what happens over time is they sort of use up the stories that they can tell at that level of power. And then they start saying, oh, by the way, he's also got this other power. Maybe he just discovered it, or maybe something else happened to him that gave him that power too, or what have you. But now we can tell a whole bunch of new stories about the same character who's got this extra power. But now, of course, the old villains don't work because they were a match for the old Peter Parker, but they can't stand up to the new Peter Parker. So we need new villains, or the old villains discover new powers. And so you get in storytelling a lot of times with franchises. You see it with Star Wars, you see it with Star Trek, you see it with any long running thing. You get an arms race, right, where the power scale goes up and up and up over the decades until eventually you've got these you've got these superheroes who have godlike abilities, and it's getting really hard for the writers to tell coherent stories about them. I mean, how do you challenge a god? Some of these superhero stories have real trouble with this. um, that supernaturalization, you take a more human figure, and over time you add more magic, more mystery, more supernatural elements. The next set of terms is standing in for a term I can't remember, and maybe one of you will. I wasted a good half hour on it this morning, and I know I've encountered it, and I just can't come up with it. But here's the combination of terms, and I'll tell you what I'm looking for: to conflate, to harmonize, to pseudo-synthesize, to amalgamate, or to syncretize. And what I'm talking about is this. I'll give you an example from Marion Zimmer Bradley's Darkover series, which I read as an adolescent. I was really excited by. And later, it turned out her husband was a child abuser. It was a great trauma to the science fiction community. And then it turned out she had participated. She'd helped procure children for him. And now, nobody wants to read any of this stuff. But at the time, it was revolutionary. She was one of the first to have women, as major protagonists in her stories. It was really revolutionary, and she supported a lot of women writers. Well, one of the things that's interesting about her as a writer is that she didn't set out to make a series in which you had to read the previous novels to understand her new one. She wrote each novel to be standalone, so that you didn't have to have read anything else. And and to do that, it meant that she didn't focus on continuity the way modern writers of series focus on continuity. And so the result would be that in one book, this one town would be a 3 days ride from the other town. But in another book written at a different time, it might be a month away. And it wasn't because of the weather. It was because she wasn't keeping track of the details very clearly, and they didn't agree with each other. And so you end up with this kind of weird collage world that's being built up in which some things agree and other things don't agree. Later in her career, this became a problem for her. Her readers who were really enthusiastic about the series were confused. Well, how can it be this at one time and that at another time? Why don't these parts agree with each other? And she would say, look, they're just standalone novels, but they wouldn't accept that because they were too invested in the world. They wanted it to make sense. So what they did was they would try to explain away the problems. They would try to come up with explanations. In Marvel Comics, in the letters column, they coined this term a no prize. And Marvel would give you a no prize when you spotted a problem like this in the Marvel stories, but you also provided a solution. Maybe it was because he behaved out of character because he was actually under the control of the supervillain who controls people's minds. So maybe just for that issue, he behaved out, but he is the same guy. He just wasn't under his own authority. And then Marvel would go, that's a great explanation. You win a no prize. What they've done is they have harmonized disjoint things that don't work very well together to try to create a story in which they kind of do work together better. If you've ever when I was younger, I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and I played it especially as the dungeon master. It was my job to come up with the core stories and settings, and then the players would all have fun in the sandbox that I created. And I did that for decades. And what happens when you do it for decades is you make these kinds of mistakes, right? The one time the two towns are 3 days apart, and another time they're a month apart, and eventually someone notices, and now you're scratching your head, and you're the one who has to harmonize them with each other, and you're going back retroactively and trying to fix discordant pieces that don't fit together to make them fit together. So that used to be the definition of the English word conflation. When you take things that didn't go well together and now you're trying to make them fit, even though they kind of don't. That was the original definition of conflation. Now conflation means to say two things are equal or true when they're not. But it used to be to try to merge two things that actually don't merge well together. Harmonize is kind of it, except harmonize in English has these entirely positive qualities. Whereas the kind of harmonization we're talking about is where there are incredibly important distinctions between things, but you're trying to erase them. There are incompatibilities that could tell us things that are meaningful, but you're trying to sand off all those rough edges and make them go away. So you create what seems like a smooth, coherent picture out of pieces that don't go together very well. I just threw the term pseudosynthesis in there, and I threw it in there because Google thinks synthesis is the right word for this. And when that result came up on my feed, I knew Hegel was spinning in his grave and someone should hook up a dynamo to him and power a small city, because this is Kantian synthesis, not Hegelian synthesis. As you remember, or may not remember, Hegel hated the use of the terms thesis, antithesis, synthesis to describe Hegel's own dialectic. He said that's Kant's dialectic. And Hegel's entire mission in life as a philosopher was to correct Kant and refute him and put him in his place. He's the last thing I want is people thinking that I'm advocating for Kantian style thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not my dialectic. He says what's wrong with Kantian dialectics is it makes you think anything can be synthesized. You can put any two random things together and mash them up, and automatically something harmonious will come out of it. He says that's not true. I mean, Nazis and Jews, you put them together, you don't get a harmony. Most things don't harmonize automatically by shoving them together. He says this cage match approach to the dialectic is entirely artificial. It's the will of the philosopher imposing himself on the material and claiming that everything is productive in his hands when it's not. And this is why Hegel says my dialectic is not about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It is about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. The things that are in opposition grow out of one another. It's through processes of development and maturation, says Hegel. That's where the dialectic is real, is in stages of development. It's not real in, I found Hulk Hogan over here and I found Arnold Schwarzenegger over there and I chuck him in a cage and, automatically I get Leonardo da Vinci. That's not how it works. Even if you think it is. So pseudosynthesis is, again, when you take alien things that don't work well together and you shove them together and make them fit and sand off the rough edges and you say, there, I have produced a synthesis. But if anybody could look below the glossy surface of lacquer that you slathered over the thing to try to make it look like a hole, they would see the seams showing. And they would see that inside the thing, there are still two separate alien things, each of which has its own logic, which is independent of the other. And that just because you sewed a bunch of parts together doesn't mean the monster you created is a human being. Frankenstein. There's a Frankensteinian quality to this, right? Amalgamate is another, syncretize is another. All right, so the reason I bring this up is that when we look at the early history of Christianity, we've all been taught that what we're going to find is it all starts with one guy who had a coherent message that he shared, and that different observers witnessed it and took away different perspectives on it. Welcome to the call, Paul. We're talking about harmonization in the context of early Christianity. So the official story is that there's one guy named Jesus. He has one period of time when he's teaching, and a number of witnesses observe it, and each of them notices different things than the others, and they go their ways and they write their accounts, and their accounts are different because they each have a different human perspective. It is a completely rational, understandable explanation for why Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and Paul, frankly, differ from each other. You'd say, well, they're different people. They're witnessing different things. But in the 19th century, when the Germans begin doing this deep analysis of the texts, they say there are problems with this theory that we all have. And the problems are that what's in the text doesn't actually support that model of their creation. They notice, first of all, John is wildly different from the other three. And so they coined the term synoptic gospel. And a synoptic gospel is one of the three that seem to agree with each other about the basic outline of Jesus's life. But then there's John, which is totally different. John's got all kinds of characters that aren't in the other three. He's got all kinds of events that aren't in the other three. He's got places that aren't in the other three. And he's got journeys from one town through a second town to a third town that doesn't agree with even the map of Judea and Galilee from that time. Some of them are as wrong as saying, I took the road north from London on my way to York, and as you know, I went through Paris, which is north of London, and passing through Paris, I then arrived at York. And John writes passages like this, where somebody goes through a town that is on the other side of Galilee, and he couldn't possibly have done that on that journey. That's not on the road. So everyone said, okay, we don't know whether John was a real witness or not. We don't understand what's going on with John. We're going to set that gospel aside as different from the other three. The other three we're going to call the synoptics. And when we look at them, we're going to see a problem. And the problem is, up until the 19th century, everyone thought Matthew was the original one. After all, it's the first one in the New Testament. And they thought that Mark and Luke came afterwards. That was the official received theory for, 1800 years. People thought that. But when they looked at the text, it didn't actually explain the similarities and differences. The similarities and differences suggested that Mark came first. its theology is less developed than Matthew or Luke. And Matthew and Luke, 75% of Mark is in Matthew and Luke as well. And these are places where Matthew and Luke agree with each other. There's a huge number of places they agree with each other where they're essentially identical to Mark. And so in the 19th century, the Germans begin going, I think we've been wrong about this. I think Mark came first. Mark came first, and Matthew and Luke, when they wrote their gospels, had a copy of Mark in front of them. And maybe they were adding things that they'd observed that Mark had missed. Maybe, who knows? But there's some explanation for the differences. And the problem becomes at this point, if Matthew's written by Matthew and Luke's written by Luke and Mark's written by Mark, which people mostly don't believe now, but if they were, it's a problem for Matthew, who was a disciple of Jesus, to be relying on Mark, who was not a disciple of Jesus, for 75% of his firsthand eyewitness testimony. Why is he dependent on this secondary source when he was supposedly there at the time, looking directly at Jesus, hearing him say things? Why doesn't Matthew write in his own words? Why is that only 25% of the Gospel of Matthew? This is what the Germans are asking themselves in the 19th century as they look at these things. And what's emerged a lot, there's been, it's taken 150 years to get through this material, but basically there's been a lot of theorizing, and it's come around to the position that, first of all, Mark didn't write Mark, Matthew didn't write Matthew, Luke didn't write Luke, and John didn't write John. Each of these represents a different Christian community, an early Christian community that had their own traditions about Jesus. And that what we see in these texts only obliquely hints at what Jesus was doing. What it tells us the most about is, what did that community inspired by Jesus, what were they interested in? What did they care about? What did they remember? What did they forget? And by comparing the Gospels in this way, you start to be able to shape the diversity of early Christian communities. You with me so far? So what Burton Mack is arguing in this book, The Lost Gospel, is Q itself is a real challenge to the understanding that we have it about an unbroken chain of apostolic succession from Jesus through his disciples to the apostles to the apostolic fathers to the first bishops and then to the subsequent bishops and all the way down to today's bishops. That this unbroken chain of authority, which was pushed by the medieval church starting in the 4th century, the evidence doesn't actually seem to suggest that that's how things happened. It doesn't look like we come out of the gate with a single coherent worldview and a single coherent theology and a single coherent account of events. And instead, we come out of the gate with, Burton Mack argues, 6, and you might say that there's maybe another 3 or 4 really different early Christian communities, most of whom haven't heard of each other. And they think Jesus was very different than the other communities. So I'll give you some examples out of this. As we saw in Q1, and as we saw in the Gospel of Thomas, we have a community who's very passionate about Jesus the teacher. They say the sayings of Jesus are the important part. And that's what they write down. And that's all they write down. Reading Thomas and reading Q1, there's nothing about Jesus's life. There's nothing about Joseph or Mary. There's nothing about dying or on a cross or a cave with the stone rolled away or being resurrected. There's nothing about heaven and hell and salvation. It's completely absent from the earliest layers of Thomas in Q1. And instead, what you've got is somebody saying, turn the other cheek. Blessed are the meek. Don't be a dick. Be a good person. Take care of each other. You got someone who's challenging the established status quo and shaking things up to try to encourage people to behave well. And that's what we have in the early layers, in the Q community and the Thomas community. But meanwhile, in a very close in time, writing in the 50s, you've got Paul. And Paul's interested in the kerygma. He's interested in the sacrifice, the death, the resurrection. He's in that drama is the centerpiece of Paul. And as Sharon says, the other major beating heart in Paul is, how do you set up a church? How do the communities talk to each other and take care of each other? How do you stay on target as time goes on, and not forget what you stand for? How do you support each other? He's talking a lot about the Spirit and what does it mean to have a direct personal conversation with the Spirit of Jesus today, not in the past, but right now, having visions and hearing the voice and getting new wisdom and authority from Jesus to speak. As Paul says, he doesn't care that he wasn't a firsthand witness to Jesus's life. He says, Peter and James and them have no greater authority than I do, even though I never met the man, because anytime I want to know what Jesus has to say, I just ask him now. And the Spirit of the Lord tells me. This is a very different group than the Q group. And furthermore, all of those wisdom sayings, turn the other cheek, rich man, a camel will sooner pass through an eye of a needle than a rich man will enter the gates of heaven. It's nowhere to be found in Paul. It's weird. It's like he never met the other guys. The Q community and the Christ community, Paul's charisma community, they don't seem to know each other. And that's weird. It's weird if we start from the assumption that the story we've been told all this time is legitimately how early Christianity worked, because the evidence seems to be that it didn't. Burton Mack says there's at least a couple more communities. You've got the fiery end of times community that ends up culminating in the Apocalypse of John, which came by its own road, separate from the others. You have the miracle community, who say the important thing about Jesus is that he worked miracles, and that's proof of this, that, or the other. And as Burton Mack points out, these communities may differ about some of the miracles in the middle, but they always agree it starts with walking on water. That's the first of the 5 miracles. And it ends with the feeding of the multitude. And in between are 3 miracles of healing in which a non-Gentile, a Gentile features prominently. And so there is this kind of weird going beyond the Jews, being cosmopolitan, having a diverse group of people working together thing that's being pulled together around these miracle stories. And that group of stories seems to be unknown to Paul. And it seems to be unknown to the Q community. And the miracle workers likewise don't seem to know much about the crucifixion and the resurrection. And they don't know much about Jesus as a teacher full of wisdom sayings. There's, like, in the early records that we find for these guys, there's very little overlap, which, I mean, it's strange, right? This is Burton Mack's core argument. This is weird. This is the evidence we have. And the evidence we have is weird from the perspective of kind of what we were raised to expect. He says there's maybe 3 other important groups. One of them, which some modern Bible historians call the brethren, are people who distinguish themselves by having an allegiance to Jesus's family. They're some kind of core group that believe it's very important that they personally met Jesus, or that they met someone who met Jesus. They're kind of tracing their relationship in that way. And as you can see, that's exactly the opposite of what Paul thinks. Paul thinks that's of no importance at all. Then there are a bunch of Jewish followers of Jesus who took up residence in Jerusalem for a time. That's another group. And then there is a group where Mark was at home, in which there is a pronouncement and debate style. One of the things that characterizes Mark and distinguishes him from some of the other writers is that in some of the other writers, Jesus's claim to fame is that he's fulfilling prophecies from the Old Testament, or that he's a wisdom teacher, or that he's going to save you from hell. But in Mark, weirdly, Jesus is a master of debate, right? He debates with the priests and with the Pharisees, and he beats them at their own game. He knows their books better than they do. He's the man who is rhetorically, incredibly fluent and quick on his feet. Mark makes that a centerpiece of Jesus's ministry. He's sort of relentlessly debating and engaging in discussion with the existing kind of priest class and coming out winning over and over. Paul doesn't seem interested in any of that or aware of it. The Q people don't seem to know about that. The miracle people don't know about that. Mark's from another group, is what Bible scholars are concluding. So when you put all these pieces and the others together, the conclusion that you reach is there's a lot of things we don't know about the early stage of Christian history. But the evidence we have suggests that shortly after Jesus' death, we have a bunch of groups who aren't very aware of each other and who see Jesus in very different ways with very little overlap. There's an enormous diversity of Christian practice. And, and maybe it's more accurate to say there's not a single Jesus movement. There are multiple Jesus movements. However it is they got started, wherever this diversity came from, there's multiple side-by-side movements. And what happens late in the first century when people start writing the Gospels is that they begin weaving them together. They start creating a single movement out of these disparate movements, right? So in the Gospels, Jesus starts to become a miracle worker and a teacher, and he died on the cross and was resurrected. These things begin pulling together, and it's the first appearance of kind of what we think of as the whole picture. But maybe that whole picture wasn't there in the beginning for whatever reason, whether it's because people misunderstood him, whether it's because we're talking about more than one guy starting more than one movement, and then eventually they get pulled in together. We don't have the evidence to answer these questions based on this is Burton Mack's argument, right? In Who Wrote the New Testament. All right, so this brings us up to date with kind of where the position was with the work on Q that we've been doing. What I'd like to do is take a little bit of time to talk about in the opening chapters of Who Wrote the New Testament. He has some really interesting history, and that history not only helps us to understand why Judaism and Christianity changed the way they did in the first and second centuries, but also helps us to understand the end of the ancient epoch in a new way. For example, he has some discussion of the temple state. You might remember I sort of hypothesized that before the ancient world, there was an older temple state era that we know even less about than we do about the city state era. And Bert and Max got some stuff on that. So if you guys are game, I'd like to dig into that together. So let's go ahead and do that. So last week we talked about, one of the things that he said, that Burton Mack said in the conclusion of the Lost Gospel, he talked about the way that although we call him Alexander the Great, and countless dictators have tried to emulate him for thousands of years ever since, what he did was actually really problematic. He took societies throughout Southwest Asia and Northeast Africa that had been functioning for thousands of years under an really ancient system called the temple state. And he smashed the temple states. He conquered all of them, just all the way to the boundaries of India. He just conquered all of those temple states, and he replaced them with city states, which was the Greek or sort of the Greek model. And we all think, well, those of us who've had too much Marxism or too much modern, great march of history or what have you, we think, well, this must be progress, right? The temple state must be an older, more primitive form. The city state must be more advanced. So really, Alexander's doing them all a favor, and that's great. I mean, we have these sort of caricatures of history in our head that we sort of try to fit things into. But Burton Mack's argument is, well, from the perspective of the people alive then, he wasn't doing anybody a favor. He was neither helping the temple state societies nor the city state societies. He says at the time that Jesus lived and the time that the gospel writers were writing, there were three old models of political economy that were in everybody's head. Everybody was deeply familiar with, and it was haunting them as they were thinking about the answer to the question, where are we supposed to go from here? And they were these. The first was the temple state, which we're going to talk about first. The second was the city state. And the third was the Roman Republic. So let's discuss these. Ancient Greece had a temple state system that was the Mycenaean and Minoan system. Maybe not Minoan, maybe just the Mycenaean. No one's quite sure about the Minoans. Um, but the things that we read about in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, there's these kings who each rule their own area and they have near absolute authority. And sometimes they can come together for joint ventures like the attack on Troy, but a lot of the time they just fight with each other. Um, it is a very different world. The Greeks believed, the ancient Greeks of classical Greece believed that that era of their ancestors was a very different kind of world to live in than the one they themselves lived in. And a lot of what they wrote about in their tragedies and comedies and epics was depicting that world, both to understand how it went right and how it went wrong. The Greeks, the city-state system, from this analysis, the city-state system was a response to the failures of the temple state. Because the Greek understanding of their own history was that their great glorious ancestors who had divine blood running in their veins because they're all children of Zeus or Poseidon or who have you, they were glorious heroes in a glorious Bronze Age, right? That they, through their virtues, destroyed the Bronze Age world, including themselves, and caused a dark age that lasted centuries. Literacy fell, trade fell, life expectancy fell, everything got worse, and it stayed worse for century after century after century. You can look up, on Google or Wikipedia or elsewhere, Bronze Age collapse and read about this. It's one of the most important periods in history, and it's one that we don't teach in the modern world very much. But to the Greeks, it was ever present in their minds. The Greeks always said that Homer is the Bible of the Greeks. And what they meant by that is that they're making sure that every Greek, whether he's a slave or a craftsman or a noble, they're all raised on the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the rest of the Trojan War cycle and the rest of the cycles of the returns, that what happened to people trying to come home from the Trojan War. And that this was the reason they formed the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, the Isthmian Games, and the Delphic Games. The whole point of them was, yeah, I mean, there's going to be people high jumping and throwing discuses and so on, of course, but that's just to get people in the door. The main events of each one of these festivals was two things. The first was a declaration of peace across the entire Hellenic world. If any city-state violated that peace, all the rest of them would turn on him. This is a time when you're, as much as you love to fight, and as much as we all love fighting, and you can fight any other time, you can't fight during this festival. Put down your sword, come to the festival. Afterwards, you can go back to killing, but not now. And the reason was everybody had to come for what was essentially a relay race marathon of epic poetry. They would start with the first of the epics in the cycle of the Trojan War, and a poet would get up there and declaim to the best of his ability as long as he could stand until he fell down or came to a nice stop. And then the next poet would stand up and pick up where he left off. And they would do this relay race. And that was the spine of an Olympic game. And meanwhile, elsewhere, all around, people hurling javelins and wrestling with each other and so on. But this is the core thing that's going on. And they did it every time. Each of these games was held every 4 years, but there were four of them. And so on alternating years, a different one would be held. So somewhere in Greece, somebody every single year, someone is telling these stories. They're being raised on them. And what is the lesson of these stories? The lesson is our ancestors had virtues so towering, they make us all look inferior. It was a golden age of heroes. And yet, they screwed everything up. We became illiterate because of them. Our lifespan fell because of them. We lost the ability to make great artworks because of them. We got cut off from each other because of them. Everything got worse because of them, because their virtues weren't harnessed. They were in conflict instead of in competition. And that conflict led to self-destruction. They wrecked it all. And what they're describing is the old temple state system in the Hellenic world, right? Because all of those were temple states. And they're saying that that system was a disaster. One of the things that classicist Gilbert Murray says in Rise of the Greek Epic is that, and in Five Stages of Greek Religion, he says the Olympian religion, which we think of as the Greek religion, was actually an artificial construct. that the Greeks began building around 800 or 776 or somewhere in that vicinity BCE by pulling together the separate tribal religions that the Greeks used to have and weaving them together into a pantheon and saying, we may have countless gods, but we're at least going to agree on these few. And we may have countless practices, but we're at least going to agree on the oracle at Delphi, and we're at least going to agree on the Olympic Games, the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games, and so on. We're going to have some common core of our culture that we all agree to share. And we can differ in every other way, but we've got to have the same language and the same core. And that's going to hold us together and keep us from repeating the mistakes of our glorious ancestors. So the Greek city-state is founded on this idea that left to our own devices, we wrecked everything. But we can avoid that if we work together, if we're conscious of our weaknesses, our liabilities, our addictions, if we're aware of these defects in our character, then we can compensate for them and we can voluntarily form city-states in which we come together and agree to govern ourselves. We lift ourselves up out of ignorance, out of sickness, short lifespans, and we create health and prosperity for ourselves. It is an act of self-governance and self-arising. And it's why, as Plato and Aristotle and other writers indicate, they're obsessed with the notion of the aristos, the person who arises, who lifts themselves up, who creates a community that is aristic so that they can govern together. So right from the outset, the Greeks have this idea of a conflict between the old temple state system, which wrecked everything, and the new city state system, which they've created for themselves. So far, so good. This is the Greek perspective. I've just, for those who haven't been on our calls much before, I've just summarized 3 years of discussions about the old city state system that we've done on this. But here's the thing. Burton Mack says that there is a work that came out in 1987 by Jonathan Z. Smith, and I don't know the title of the book. Maybe somebody else can look it up while I'm talking here. He says Jonathan Z. Smith has written the definitive book about the temple state system in Southwest Asia. Everybody's been obsessed with the Greeks, but he actually turned his attention away from the Greeks to look at how did Babylon run itself? How did Phoenicia run itself? How did Syria run itself? Before the Alexandrians came in and wrecked everything, what was this system that existed from the shores of the Mediterranean all the way to the boundaries of India? And so I'm going to cover a little bit of that now because this has been a gap in our understanding during the previous 3 years. He says there's three major components to the temple state system. It's based on a dialectic between power and purity. A dialectic between power and purity. You have a king, and the king has power, but he's impure. And he's impure because he wields that power and he gets blood on his hands. They say it is, and this is a far cry from the medieval concept that comes later. But their idea is you cannot be a king who's all good. You're going to do some bad things. That's just what it means to wield power. And if a society is based strictly on impure power, it'll destroy itself. You'll have no civilization. It won't last long. So they said the second pillar of making this go is purity, but with no power, with what we might call powerlessness. And that's the priest. And the priest is in the temple. And the priest is rigorous about following the rules of purity and cleanliness. And the whole community orbits around the temple. And their focus is on, I'm mortal, I err, I've made mistakes, I've screwed up in my life. How do I make things right? How do I, what is restorative justice? They go to the temple to find out what should I engage in to make up for the terrible things I've done? How do I ritually purify myself, and how do I do good in my community? And the priest tells them. But the priest wields no authority over the military, right? There is a complete separation between the power of the king and the purity of the priest. But they need each other. They need each other. You can't have completely powerless purity, or else it's not having an effect on the world. You can't have impure power or your societies collapse. And so there is a third pillar that holds this all together, and that's the scribes. And the scribes are anonymous go-betweens between the priest and the king. They document what the oracle at Delphi says. They document the king's new laws. He cites the example of the Code of Hammurabi. And for any, I don't know if anyone here has actually read the Code of Hammurabi, but it opens up with pages of flattery. I mean, it says all the things Hammurabi did that are glorious, that show that he's just the greatest king, right? He's just amazing. He did this and he did that and he did that. And after it finishes all that flattery, it then says, and he promulgates the following laws. And then it lays out a law code that ties the hands of Hammurabi. And Smith says, reading this is a remarkable thing because you have to think Hammurabi never would have done that to himself. But he's not a scribe, right? He had people for that. His scribes wrote down what the law code is. And in the act of writing down what the law code is, they both flatter the king and also moderate the king's power, presumably based on, the kinds of things the priests are telling them. How do you go about creating a just society, and how do you be pure, and blah blah blah. So there's a weird tension in the Code of Hammurabi between the power authority of the king and the purity authority of the priest. And Smith's point is, although we like to pretend that every change in history is progress, and therefore the temple state must have been bad and the city state must be good, he says the truth is, until Alexander wrecked everything, that temple state system had succeeded for 3,000 years. It's astonishing how well it worked. And they might have changed from time to time which language we speak and exactly which gods we speak. The borders might have moved from time to time, but it didn't move anywhere near as fast as it would later on. And there wasn't nearly as much social disruption. So what happens going into that is that Alexander the Great has his new military that his dad Philip developed, and it's the greatest military the world's ever seen. And he leads it out to conquer the Middle East. He conquers Egypt, and he conquers all the way to the boundaries of Egypt. And everywhere he goes, he eliminates the king. The old king side of the authority is gone permanently. It never comes back. And he replaces it with what on the surface looks like Hellenic civilization, a new city-state system. And this is what I always thought before I began reading this book, right? He Hellenized all these areas. But Smith's argument and Burton Mack's argument is he did something far worse than that. Because the city-state was not an instrument of conquest originally. The city-state was an instrument of self-emancipation. We are in a dark age. We are all fighting each other. We can't get any traction to try to make the world a better place. We have to come together voluntarily and agree to form a council. And that council is going to deliberately choose to convert conflict into competition and persuasion and governance. And by doing that, we lift ourselves up together and we all have the franchise. That's the deal, right? On this call, although I'm the one talking right now, at any point, anybody can raise their hand. And when they do, I'm going to call on them because we can all talk, right? We all have a role to play in this. We are lifting each other and ourselves up. That's the city-state system. But what Alexander the Great does is he builds new city-states side by side with the capitals of the old temple states. And he puts in charge his cronies, who are military dictators. And the franchise is extended to the Greeks who've helped conquer the place, but not to the people they've conquered. So if you're in Persia, you were a Persian citizen and you had a coherent society, between the king and the priest and the scribes, in which you had a say and you had a role to play. But that's all gone now. And under the new system, you're just a subject and you don't get a vote. And furthermore, your culture and your value system and your religion only work if they're supported by the political economy of the old king and priest system with the scribes in between. But now that that's not there anymore, your culture is uprooted. You're like a plant that's been pulled up out of the soil. You want your value system, your character wants to express itself, but it's trying to express itself in a hostile environment. You're being taxed, but you're not getting a say. You're being you're being exposed to all these other cultures, but you're not being given any place to, you don't know how to mesh with them. You don't know how to meld with them. You're not being given the kinds of we lift ourselves up together forums or councils that would allow you to gradually figure out together where you wanted to go from here. And instead, you've got just a bunch of chopped up pieces swirling around together, not fitting. So on the one hand, it's wrecking the temple state system across half of Asia. I mean, maybe it's a quarter of Asia, right? It's not the North. But on the other hand, he says he's also wrecking the city-state system because these city-states are fake city-states. They're not, they're not, they don't have those qualities that the Greek city-states were supposed to be. They're being ruled by little Greek kings. There's that problem with the franchise. There is the fact that they're being used militarily, and the result is that the people who were raised on Greek culture have their own version of the same problem that the people raised on the temple state culture have. They still believe in Greek culture, but if they go into these Hellenistic city states in Southwest Asia, they find they don't have the freedoms that they have. Don't have the responsibilities that they would have had in Greece. They aren't governing themselves. They aren't making decisions for themselves. They have to do what the new, military crony of Alexander tells them to do. And so not only are the old temple state citizens disenfranchised and adrift and uprooted, where their culture no longer has a political economy that supports it. The same is true for all the people who grew up under the old city-state system. They're in a situation where the new political economy doesn't satisfy them either. And so the result is everybody's swirling around with cultures that have no legs under them. They have these yearnings and dreams and beliefs and behavioral patterns and conventions that don't have a home anymore. He says it created this Smith's argument, which Burton Mack basically agrees with, is that the result is Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies, his successors who followed him, and the Seleucids who took over after the Ptolemies, together they basically created this massive sense of dislocation across the entire, Eastern Mediterranean, that left people anxious. They left them in a situation where they were doing a lot of cross-cultural comparison on the fly without the kind of support that they would have needed, just because their neighbors don't speak the same language, don't have the same religion, etc. On the one hand, and on the other hand, it left them in need of a political economy that would fit the culture that they believed in, which and the political economy that they had wasn't that political economy, it was imposed upon them. So everybody is having utopian struggles right now, trying to figure out where the hell do we go from here? This is absolutely not working. Now what? He says that was the mindset at the time of Jesus. And it wasn't just Jesus's mindset. That's the Jews were thinking that this isn't working. The Romans came in and smashed their temple state. That it was not working. Having the Romans do that to them left them in a similarly disjoint situation. The Greeks were thinking that, the Syrians were thinking that, everybody is thinking that, and they all know they've got a problem and they don't know how to solve it. That's what's on everybody's minds at this time in history. He's going to go on. I haven't read far enough. He's going to go on and say that the third thing on everybody's mind was the Roman Republic, because at the time we're talking about, the Roman Republic had been smashed and replaced with an empire, but everybody remembered the Republic. Even in Rome, everybody talked about the Republic. I mean, Augustus and his successors are relentlessly, their propaganda is always relentlessly saying, the reason to support me as the emperor is because I am embodying the virtues of the old Roman Republic. There's branding around the Roman Republic. So you can't be a citizen of Rome anywhere without having this third model of the Republic, which is now gone, being foisted on you. And the Roman citizens themselves have this problem where their forefathers grew up under the value system of the Republic. And then suddenly there was a period of civil wars and an empire is imposed on them. But their value system and allegiances are still to an old political economy that's not here anymore. So even they are uprooted and dislocated under the empire. So this is the massive ferment that's going on. So why don't I stop here for now on this, and we can move on to Kenneth in a moment. But I just want to start and say, questions, answers, the concerns that people have about kind of what we're talking about. All of this sort of it's a very different interpretation of Middle Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean history than what I grew up with. Maybe you guys already knew all this stuff. I certainly didn't. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you're muted.
No, I mean, you've covered quite a bit, but in thinking, what is it that um, enables a culture to flourish? And when you're thinking about that in terms of, you're talking about the different states and different types of organizational structures that actually can keep it together, and versus maybe in certain cases there are other approaches that, like, meaning that they have and I was reading about this, the idea of things like geography that tend to then create the environment that's actually makes it possible for culture to a civilization to thrive. But I think that I mean I'm much more on the side of you as that, or your side, in the sense that it is the institutions, and once they're corrupt, that you start to see a where power becomes too imbalanced, and that is a way of them being maybe not necessarily corrupt, but it's the system that seems to be rigged at that point, because it seems like there's this uneven distribution. Then that is where you start to see essentially people turning to alternatives. And if we go back to the earlier conversations that we've had that are interesting about how the church had come to power and what Augustine had written specifically about how these other structures have all failed, and now that this is the new approach, that having a city of God, so to speak, that this is the way now things are going to operate. And I mean, ultimately, what you're starting to see, I think, is it's a breakdown in power and power distribution, I should say, and it's just simple corruption. So then you have to think about it. What is it that then prevents that? And that's where I think a lot of what Kenneth is talking about and what you're covering really comes into play. It says you're talking about the particulars in that sense. So, but do you give any credence to those other theories that that more that a nation's, and I don't necessarily do, but it is based off of the values or the ability for it to sustain itself or thrive is based more on its geography or things along those lines, its assets, its resources, and things that then enable the country to participate in a more of a global global economy. I'll just say, I'll go there and say that, because that does have some credence, but I think that there are examples that say that that's not necessarily true, and that it is the institutions and the way they govern themselves. I don't know. Just a quick thought. I've been listening.
Yeah. It's a good question. There is a tendency in the modern world to try to reduce success or failure in human societies to the political economy. Um, Marx himself never did that. He always said the culture mattered. But a lot of Marxists say the culture doesn't matter, that it is just a sort of consequence or effluvia that flows out of the selection of the political economy. And in that, I think that the people who reason that way are failing to understand something that Marx understood, that Hegel understood, and that it sounds like Smith and Mack understands, which is you have to have a culture that makes sense of the world and makes you feel like this is worth doing. Despair is a problem for human beings. Feelings of futility, feelings of meaningless. You can destroy a people through that, as we see throughout history. You need a value system and ways of relating to each other that make it feel like this is working. This is worth doing. We're doing the right thing. We're trying to pay attention to the right things. That has to go hand in hand with having a political economy. If you have a political economy but you don't believe in it, if like you believe it's corrupt, it's just rotten to the core, you're never going to work as hard to rebuild it after it suffers insults or losses over the
Mm.
natural getting knocked around course of history. We've talked about this idea that the difference between the early Roman Empire under Augustus and the late Roman Empire at the time it fell is that by the time the late Roman Empire came in, no one believed in it anymore.
Right.
So the next round of barbarians did the same thing that any previous round of barbarians had done, but this time nobody bothered to rebuild because they're like, fuck it, it can't be worse than what we've got. It's like maybe this barbarian king will tax me less than my horrible governor. It's like,
Right.
if you don't believe in it, you aren't going to be willing to make the horrible sacrifices that from time to time are called upon. And without people's willingness to work hard to keep a society put together, it just blows down in the first hurricane to come along, and then it doesn't get rebuilt. It's just like,
It's interesting that you put it that way, because if you look at countries like Argentina that have a very similar constitution to the United States, yet they've had a lot of coups and a lot of instability. So then what is it? Well, it's the people's belief in that constitution that actually keeps it going, not necessarily the constitution itself. So, and that is, and then that's that's where I think it really speaks to the trust among the citizens, and less to the idea that the culture itself. Now, cultures do have values, that's for sure. But I think that there are some universals that appeal to those values, and as you just said, like people are going to say, "Forget it, I'm just going to." It's the what I could possibly lose, is, well, it's next to nothing. I mean, what do you, and it's worth it. And it's the alternative is what? Maybe something better on the other side. And so it becomes obviously a trade-off. And it's interesting just how, we think about the world. We think about it in terms of, we start to, what do we then, what are the most important values? But obviously when you're talking about basic needs and trade and things along those lines, when those things break down, or there are corruptions, or there seems to be injustices, and then that's when things start to collapse in on themselves. Anyway, I firmly, believe that what you said, and that belief is fundamental. It's not just the idea per se that is going to keep it together. It's going to be the belief in the institutions themselves.
Yeah, I working in medical informatics, one of the things that I did was start a few nonprofits along the way over the last 25 years. And so I'm well acquainted with the whole, if people are fed up with something that's not working, can someone come along to give them a new perspective on it, a new coherent picture that makes sense of why we were failing before and offers kind of a clear guidance for if we would just do these things instead, maybe we could succeed together. And that notion of, a diagnosis is part of that worldview, that the sense of why did we fail, and then a prognosis combined with a prescription. It's not hopeless. It was arbitrary that we did those things wrong. We really could just behave differently and get a better outcome. And then it's combined finally with, but we can't do it alone. We can't do it as separate people. We only together can we make this work. That's all it takes to begin a new movement of people,
Right.
because then they start thinking maybe it's worth it to work together. Maybe it's worth it to sacrifice a little bit for each other. And the moment you get that, you start to get some resiliency and some growth.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's I've also been on the flip side where you had a viable society, but there was so much infighting and people disagreed so much, and then there was some sabotage. And at some point you get to, you're like, fuck this. I would
Right.
rather be alone than not have to go to another goddamn meeting. I don't want to have another argument. I'll just sit by myself in my room and write my little software, and I don't care if nobody but me uses it. At least it will work, and I won't be being interfered with all the time by other people. And this is, if Stephen was here, he'd be writing centrifugal versus centripetal in the
Yeah.
comments right now, because that's the issue, right?
Right.
Is it better to be together and help each other, or is it better to go your own way to get away from the chaos and interference?
Yeah, there's an interesting paper that I'll post in the chat that is just based off of this, with the idea of migration patterns. And and it really is, there, it just shows how maybe there are cultural values change with migration patterns based off of the individuals that are pursuing their own personal, like, interests, versus the individuals that focus more on the value of their communities. Anyway, it's, but I mean, I also want to thank you really quickly for the beginning of this, when you started talking about knowing and self-knowing and anything like that, because that spurred something that was really helpful, and I'll put that in the chat as well. But I'm not going to keep talking. But definitely there was something that was very, very helpful in a class that I had taken at one point, or watched anyway. So anyway, I'll let Sharon go. She's been waiting patiently.
Thanks, Joe. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So that was a very excellent introduction. But what I want to do is make sure that I understand the basic elements of it. In the establishment of early Christianity, there was significant discord. There was a different belief. There was discord between the Jews and the Christians. And there was questions about the nature of Jesus. But it seems that the society seems to have come together and functioned as a quasi-unit, secondary to the impact of Constantine, right? And one of the things that he did, and you talk about the values that govern a society, the process of building those churches and all the adorations that they had, that was a way I think they transmitted the values. Because if you look at all the stained glass windows and all the paintings, that's the way, that's another method that I thought they even use to translate the value system and the operational nature of this society. And the second thing that I did, that I think Constantine did to govern the society, is he established the social services for Jesus, healing of the sick and the poor, right? And that really helped, I don't want to say if it's the satisfaction of people, but really establish a value system, the caring, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christianity. So with all the things that you talked about, that seems to be a central element. And I don't know if it's too simple, but what kept the medieval society together. So help me understand that. Did I get that?
Yeah. Yeah, and that becomes clear in Paul, among other places, but you'll also see it in the Didache and elsewhere. There is a lot of discussion of the cycles of life in the Christian community, the early Christian community involving getting together for meals and making sure that nobody starves and taking care of each other. And if this is a religion that is early on appealing to slaves, especially, and the poor, well, these are the people that the Roman Empire said, we don't care if you live or die. You suck. Only the emperor is awesome and the people close to him. And as you go further down the pecking order, the value of human life lowers and lowers and lowers until people are being exploited and treated as disposable. And here come these early Christian sects who are saying, I may not have much, but I'll share it with you. Let's have a meal together. You won't be alone. You'll have somebody to talk to. I'm told that one of the major appeals, which you see in Paul, by the way, um, is that the Roman culture was extraordinarily misogynistic. I mean, really misogynistic. Even today's misogynists would be shocked and horrified by kind of how awful it was. Um, this is one of the things Augustine writes about in his memoirs when he says, when he was a kid, he'd go to dinners with his parents, and most the people around the table were Roman pagans, and looking around the table, almost all the women had bruises on their faces from where their husbands beat them because it was so common. And as Augustine says, the only woman at the table who didn't have bruises was his own mother. And he said he doesn't attribute that to his father being any better than the rest of them. He only attributed it to the fact that she was so extraordinarily good at reading his moods and figuring out how to never, ever, ever cross him. Because he says, it was just a time of extreme violence against women. But here's Paul saying women are to be respected. They too can serve as prophets, empty vessels for the Holy Spirit. And he said, and he gives lists of women and exhorts the churches, you should listen to these women. You should let them tell you what Jesus expects of you. They're holy. They're as holy as I am. He says, and first of all, that is really not typical for the Roman period, as I was just alluding to. But 100 years later, it's not going to be typical either, right? The church is, as the church starts to cozy up to the Roman Empire, it starts to go backwards and become more patriarchal, misogynistic. But in early Christianity, there is this stage where if you're a woman and you don't want to get knocked around, you might want to go spend some more time in these early Christian communities because they're going to, get together and have dinner and listen to you and respect you. And that's something you're not getting a lot of in life. My wife, as I've mentioned, Beverly, she's studying at Bright College of Divinity. She's pursuing a master's of theology right now. And one of the things that they talk about is how part of what made it possible for the early Christian house churches as a community to survive is that they were often sponsored by rich widows. We have lots of evidence of rich widows. And you could imagine why a woman who had some money under her belt might feel like this was a more attractive place to hang out than, say, traditional Roman society, where she'd be expected to become another adjunct to an abusive man, remarry, and instead here she's being given a position of authority in which the entire house church is dependent on her largesse, and they want to listen to what she has to say. And so it became that became sort of a small economic engine, kind of helping these communities to hold together and take care of each other and get together and kind of regularly feed one another, clothe one another. A charity in the medieval period is as prominent a duty of a Christian as it is today for Muslims. I mean, I don't know how many people know about Islam, but I mean, in Islam, charitable giving is not optional. There is no road to heaven in Islam by just, keeping your own soul together and being good. If you're just being good and having faith, you're going to go to hell. In Islam, you have to give. You have to take care of the poor. And the early Christian church and the medieval church were a lot more like that than some modern churches. In the modern era, there's more of diversity. Some modern churches are very big on charitable giving and taking care of the poor, and others could care less and are all about personal salvation. There's a huge diremption now in the world. But in the medieval period, it was like it was in the early Christian period, where what you're talking about, taking care of the least of us, It was a duty. It's all the Christian mystic writers of the Middle Ages talk about it. It's the whole idea that that was irrelevant is a modern creation.
So I got one last quick question. So the diversity of theology, which we're finding out about, how much did the society at the time know about it? Was this one of the roots of the discord? And the second thing, what impact did the teachings of Augustine and Aquinas have on the establishment of these societies, and maintenance and lack of discord and all that kind of stuff?
What a great pair of questions. To address the second one first, I'm not going to say today because Augustine and Aquinas are such important figures that each of them needs its own module, right? They need their own module. So later, after we get through the early church period, we'll do a set of weeks on Augustine, and then a little later we'll do a set of weeks on Aquinas, because what the impact that they had is very much related to what the struggles were at the time they were writing, and we're not there yet. In our discussions, we're still talking about how it emerged. Neither Augustine nor Aquinas could have existed during this period. The things that they believed in, the things that they advocated, nobody was advocating at this time in early Christianity because they had far more fundamental concerns like, how do I make sure my neighbor doesn't starve to death? I mean, we're working at a very early stage of the church coming together right now. But eventually, I mean, you're asking the right questions because both Augustine and Aquinas play incredibly important roles in pulling together the theology of the medieval worldview at different points. And as far as the diversity, now I'm going to hark back to the thing I was saying at the beginning about epistemology from an existentialist philosophical perspective and say, I'm not coming with any dogma about what early Christianity was like, other than to say, we really don't know what early Christianity was like. I mean, not the way that we know contemporary events. I mean, you know far more about what's happening in Ukraine or Israel today or in Venezuela than any of us know about what was happening in early Christianity, because there's so little that survived from that period. Well, we just have scraps. We have a few documents, and that's it. And we're really having to, like with working the fragments of Heraclitus, we really have to milk those scraps for everything we can get out of them to try to sketch in parts of the picture. And that's why I find Burton Mack's writing in these two books so useful, because he's really trying to sketch in what was going on in general. We may not know a lot about early Christianity specifically, but we do know a lot about what was happening in the area overall. And that really helps to frame a little bit what could have been possible or not possible back then. I mean, it was only through Burton Mack that I really cemented the understanding of how in Galilee it was only a minority that even spoke Hebrew. Unlike Judea, where it's, Judea was closer to a monoculture. It had been Hellenized, but it was still closer to a monoculture. But Galilee, that was just a crossroads. Everybody spoke everything. There was all kinds of languages. I didn't know that. And it really changes my understanding of what's possible for the early church to think about that. What if you're not just a congregation of Jews who all believe you're Jews and all agree about the law, if you're a congregation of Persians and Syrians and Greeks and Romans and Jews and Phoenicians and other people, and you're all trying to form a house church together, it's a very different situation. And it makes us ask different questions. So my core argument about the early Christian period is this: we kind of have to set aside our dogmas because we don't actually know much. We believe a lot about it, but we don't actually know much about it. And instead just open ourselves up to whatever evidence we do have and try to think about what does that suggest, what's possible. And then when we're finished, what we end up with is not a dogma, but a model. And it's like, well, maybe it was like this. here's the weak spots in my model. I sure hope somebody finds some evidence here. But the parts that sort of feel more coherent, maybe it was like this. I think that's about as far as we can get. The Jesus Seminar, we've talked about the Jesus Seminar, the largest international gathering of mainstream biblical scholars in the history of the world. Hundreds of them came together for over 10 years to form the Jesus Seminar. And they if I'm recapitulating for the people who weren't here when we talked about it. And they spent a whole bunch of time in the 80s and 90s going through every manuscript that we now have of Mark, of Matthew, of Luke, of the epistles, and including a bunch of the non-canonical documents like Thomas. And they went through them all and used all of the contemporary science we have to do textual analysis and figure out where have these documents been tampered with? How do we explain the differences if we've got 3 different manuscripts of Mark? How do we explain the differences between them? And from that, they tried to establish as closely as they could what would be the most authentic text we have from Paul. What's the most authentic text we have from Mark, and so on. And then out of all that, what's our best guesses about what Jesus really said and did? And the conclusion that they reached is maybe 90% of what we have that we think tells us about Jesus doesn't actually tell us about Jesus. 10% of it maybe does. 10% of it seems pretty solid. But about 90% of what we think about Jesus, what it tells, it's not that it tells us nothing. It tells us something very important that we didn't know to value before. And that is, it tells us what these different early Christian communities believed. That's what it tells us. And that's good. That fills in some gaps, right? It's frustrating for us that it doesn't take us right back to Jesus. But in a lot of cases, they say maybe a given document has been tampered with so much there's no way to know anymore from the text we have how much of it goes all the way back to Jesus. But you can say that it tells us about Christians in the 90s or the 60s. And that's great because that's a gap that otherwise we don't know anything about. And that's sort of where I end up on this. I think the Jesus Seminar is probably right. As much as we want to get back to Jesus, what these texts let us do is they do let us get back to the early Christians who followed him and see what was on their minds. What did they care about? What were they worried about? And then we could sort of guess inferentially that had something to do with what Jesus meant to them or said to them or did around them. Jesus himself will remain kind of a mysterious enigma on the fringes of history who, because of where he was writing, we're not going to ever get as much documentation as we want about exactly what he did and said, which is, okay. Most people have nothing, right? Most people who lived and had an impact on the world, there's nothing written about them. We'll never know. That's just how life is. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just really quickly, one of the things that Sharon was actually getting to in a way, but also I think that is important is the when we're talking about, what is it that causes unrest. And I think it's that when you look at the institutions that are governing, they are unable to adapt primarily, and this relates back to what you were saying about dogma. And so that the institutions that they're not able to evolve essentially, because then the people that actually get power that were actually going to correct it all of a sudden become the very thing that they actually were trying to oppose. And so that there is that cycle that needs to be able to occur in order for something to actually live. And this is what happens. Even an example would be the Bolshevik Revolution would be a perfect example of this. That once everybody, the established order had, gained power, they didn't want to necessarily give that up. So that inability in it to mimic nature. But this is also this idea of knowledge itself. Knowledge is actually, when coming back to dogma, knowledge is something that is passed through, the participation of people, not necessarily just one truth. And that's where things are, and that's what happens is that this is the way things are. And it doesn't necessarily involve a distributed power kind of system, and that ultimately then that ends up being so stagnant that it can't necessarily evolve the way it needs to in order to maintain order. So anyway, this is it's just one thought that I was actually kind of linking this idea of dogma and how institutions are static and become static and how they're no longer adaptable. And you can kind of see that they don't necessarily mimic nature properly. Well, they don't, I mean, but if they don't they maintain their power structures. Anyway, and we've covered that extensively. How people that are planning the revolt are all of a sudden in the problem.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's I'm not gonna end up being able to say anything clear about why there is this diversity in the very earliest Christian communities that we can detect. I don't know why. But I do want to moderate something that I said in response to Sharon. It's not that I can say that we will never know, because after all, it was only the 1940s when those two guys hunting for fertilizer stumbled across that jar and broke it open and found a dozen books at Nag Hammadi. And that revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity and late Judaism and in the late Temple period. I mean, we learned so much through that accidental discovery. One of the points that Burton Mack makes, in the opening of Who Wrote the New Testament, is this idea that the Q hypothesis had become unpopular. The hypothesis that there was a second source other than Mark that Matthew and Luke must have had in front of them when they were writing their own gospels, that became unpopular in the early 20th century because other things had come up. People were excited about other things. I mean, there were world wars, there were all kinds of things going on. It had fallen out of fashion. But then these two shepherds, they knock open this jar, and inside of it they find 12 volumes, and in there is the Gospel of Thomas. And Thomas is exactly the kind of sayings document, nothing but sayings, no narrative, no theology. I mean, no coherent theology, no kerygma, no apocalypse. It's just here's some things Jesus said. And it reads like Confucius or Lao Tzu or Heraclitus. And the fact that we could hold the physical document and see that there was such a thing as a sayings document completely changed people's interpretation about the hypothesis of Q. Because before that, it was just, well, we think there was the sayings document. I was like, sure, whatever. I mean, if there were sayings documents, how come we don't have any more examples? But then we found one. It's like, oh, I guess they were a real thing. All of a sudden, the Q hypothesis looks a lot better. Maybe there was a Q. I mean, there was a Thomas. There could have been a Q. The whole discussion was changed by an accidental find. So I don't intend to say today that it's not that we will ever find, more early works, because we are still finding early works. I also think about, the Heracleum in Pompeii, buried by Vesuvius, and they found that cache of scrolls. I mean, there's just huge numbers of carbonized scrolls, which unfortunately, some of which they destroyed at first because they didn't know what they were. God, it just kills me. And then eventually they figure out that they're charred scrolls. And now they're starting to work out how to read these things without breaking them or unrolling them. And we're going to get all these lost works of Epicureanism and Stoicism, and God knows what all they're going to find in there. We don't even know what all's going to come out of that. That same thing could happen at any moment. I mean, we all think Jesus never wrote anything down, right? Because we never found anything. But literally tomorrow, somebody could dig up something that says, "Hi, I'm Jesus, and this is what I think." And if it's borne out, if the archaeology bears it out, then suddenly we all have to say, well, I guess now we know a lot about Jesus and his life because he said so. And this could happen at any moment. And it's why I like the scientific method as an augment for the philosophical approach here, as the core of our epistemology. Because as long as we are not too attached to our own ideas and models, we can remain open to new evidence. And if the evidence says something we didn't expect, then instead of getting angry and defensive and trying to fight for our old bad ideas, we can laugh See, that's fantastic. I was so completely wrong. Ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. It's hilarious that I really thought it was because, all of the evidence that I was citing as proof turns out it was all evidence to the contrary and I was misreading it. I think that's hilarious. It's funny to me. I mean, I'm sorry for the people I misled, but I think it's funny. And it can be funny to anybody to discover that you're wrong when it's especially this is why I really laughed about that one because I was really big on how educated I was about evolution. It's when it's something you're proud of and you invest a lot of time and energy in trying to get right, and it turns out that's what you got wrong, not something you never really studied, and of course you got it wrong. It's not your area of expertise. No, smack dab in the middle. It's like if Sharon 30 years into her career as an anesthesiologist made some sudden breakthrough that some core tenet that she'd always believed about anesthesia was just dead wrong. And she'd been misreading it all this time. And now she realizes, holy, how did I miss that? It's in the middle of my expert of all the places to find a big aha experience. I don't expect it to be right here in the place I've been searching the most. That's funny, right? It's ironic. And it doesn't have to be threatening. It can be welcoming and charge you with enthusiasm and excitement about learning new things.
And it doesn't invalidate what was being done before, meaning
Well,
that
that's right.
you had to do something in order to get there, right?
Yeah,
So that, and that's the idea of integrating knowledge, where is that, you start to become adaptable. But if you
that's right.
suppress that, then that's the opposite.
That's when
So,
you
I
get in
mean,
trouble.
so, and that's the, sometimes even the problems that people, will double down on. I mean, depending on, there's no absolute here, but depending if you want to say people are rational actors or non-rational actors, and an economist has spent their entire life, assuming one or the other, and that they're not willing to integrate that new information. But it's not as if what they did was meaningless. It just
Right.
means that that they were not necessarily they didn't have the knowledge at the time,
That's right.
but they become so vested in what they've done that they're refused to actually kind of to demonstrate, like to accept
Yeah.
anyway.
Like the geocentric universe, the idea that the Earth was at the middle and everything revolved around it.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
It didn't have to be the big fight that it was. People could have related to that differently. Instead of saying I'm a prophet of God and I know what God thinks, and every time I open my mouth, only the pure, unadulterated truth comes out, and don't you dare contradict me, which is what set them up to be so deathly wrong about this. They could
Right.
have said, "Look, I'm not God. I'm not standing outside of it all looking at it. I'm just telling you the best model I have. And when the evidence comes out that shows that I was completely wrong, you're right. I could have compassion for that earlier self and say, well, that's the thing about being human. We are going to make blunders. And if we make it safe to have a blunder and to learn from our mistakes, maybe other people will be willing to, give us the same benefit of the doubt in return. Yeah, you're right on, Joe.
Thank you.
Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay. One, your favorite evolutionary biologist wrote a book, Ontogeny and Phylogeny. I actually have a copy of it. I actually read it. I'm not sure I remember it, but it was it, just reading the blurb about it. It says he exposes that it's wrong. So he probably helped straighten you out. Who knows? There we go. Two, I know there's a lot of historical questions here, and we probably shouldn't substitute a philosophical method for a historical method at this point, but in antiquity, we don't see the concept that certain virtues are infinite in nature. that there is something in human nature that is spirit, not soul. And yet, about 300 AD or something, it's pretty clearly established. So whether we ever historically work through that or not, that change did occur, and we still have I mean, the results of that are still with us. Now, this led me to think, Nietzsche led me to rethink something that Nietzsche, that Christianity is a slave morality. And Nietzsche, he was a fairly ironic guy, sometimes hard to understand what he's saying. But at the beginning, Christianity may have been a slave morality developed maybe with Jesus, maybe without, maybe, I don't know, don't have to answer that question. But it was the oppressed developing this idea of spirit, of infinity, of that love can proceed forever, we don't run out of it. And then later, Christianity becoming a slave morality designed by Bonosoi to enslave and control the oppressed. So was being a Christianity being a slave morality, was it a dynamic historical creation of oppressed slaves under the Romans? That is, it's the morality, a natural morality coming out of the life of slaves? Or is it the sort of morality that it's a slave morality? It's the kind of morality that one imposes upon slaves in order to control them. There's I don't know if Nietzsche was funny that way, but he was funny other ways, and I mean, but you can see that slave morality could be read just a few hundred years apart, could be understood quite differently as a great contribution to knowing ourselves as human beings that clearly occurred, versus its corruption into how do we rule the world, and when we talk about epistemology, ideologies and stuff like that, the ones that I like, some people are kind of idealist, or there's kind of just circular reasoning and stuff like that. They never get out of their own bubble. But there are others that come in some form to the conclusion that if I think these thoughts, I am right in imposing myself on others. Which this includes almost all of modern politics, or politics from the mid 20th century on, is that if we just think the right things, we're justified in controlling other people's lives. And they're pretty evil. And you can't say, well, that's the left, or that's the right, or that's there are all kinds of people get confused in their epistemology that way. It's not really epistemology. It's sort of like false, and I don't know.
moral competence, remembering that you want to let other people manage their own lives as much as possible, and you want to interfere when you must, not when you can. This is one of those things you learn in kindergarten. Sort of like worry a little bit more about whether you're being a good person to others and a little bit less about others. And you really, really jump in when other people are going too far and hurting folks. And that's when you intervene. But this is so easy to lose track of when you're enthralled by an ideology that seems to suggest you have all the answers. And now you can just make a perfect world if all you do is impose them on everybody else. Everybody falls for, I mean, every political stripe has fallen for it at some time. It's interesting, and it's one of the things that is weirdly absent in the Q1 layer and in Thomas. Thomas is all about, I've got a secret. Do you want to know my secret? If you don't, that's cool. I'll move on. It's like, pay attention or don't. I don't care. No skin off my teeth. And Q is very much, yeah, you want to get out there and confront the status quo and raise questions, and you want to be good to each other, and otherwise it's definitely not, all people should do the following things. That
Well,
kind of universalizing.
whether we ever know much about Thomas or Q or anything, there clearly was a transvaluation of values that occurred. A real
Yes.
change in, I mean, the Greeks had genothe seauton, but they didn't come up with infinite spirit or recognize that certain virtues had this characteristic of infinity,
Yes.
and that it changes the relationship between, that men have with each other. So something happened.
Yeah.
The historians can work on this, and the philosophers will just say, "Oh, something happened. We're going to go on now."
Yes.
We doubt you're going to prove that it didn't happen.
No.
Maybe.
Now,
Okay. Well, thank you.
over the next month or two, with the things that we're going to go through, we will certainly be able to trace the change. We won't necessarily be able to explain the change, but we'll be able to see it in real time as we move, to the later writings. You could sort of see, wow, this is different from what this is sure different from Q1. Wow. Somebody had an epiphany somewhere. So I shared in the chat the link to the Wikipedia article about Kunstformen der Natur, which is Art Forms in Nature by Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel. Curse you, Ernst Haeckel. He's the one who led me astray to believe that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And he didn't just lead me astray through intellectual argument. I shared one of the images from Art Forms in Nature. It is one of the most beautiful scientific books ever created in the history of the world. Anybody who has not looked at it, the illustrations of all the different life forms and their body shapes and their colors, and it's not done clinically. It's done in these beautiful swirling melanges of the different animals moving the ways that they move, and it is just one of the prettiest things ever. He's one of my scientific art heroes. It's unfortunate that he believed a false ideology about evolution, but as Donald suggested in the chat, it was Stephen Jay Gould who set me straight about the defects of Ernst Haeckel's understanding of evolution. So this is how these things go. Donna, I'm off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, hello. I'm not used to talking, but something, so please, forgive me. So this ties into two last people who spoke. And I came to believe at this point, by this point, especially based on some contemporary neuroscience, which I see Ari's got his hand raised, he'll be talking, that our brains are predictive, our survival is based on our brain predicting for survival. And what it predicts with is our past experiences. So that's what we have as a matter of survival is our experiences. Just an aside, like I'm really big on getting as much experience in life as you can so that you can survive better and be well and all these things. So, and then of course our brain gets feedback and checks and balances and goes on and on about quote unquote reality. But it's about survival. So I had thought this before, and now I really think this because of what I have recently heard about the brain science, is that, and this is totally personal experience, forever, is that people get threatened. So the reason that they would don't want to control others or fight to death about a thought, a belief, is I had come to think that it's so basic somehow this is before the science, it's so basic in their experience of that they're going to survive based on this quote unquote reality. And all these things are construed around that. So if you knock that out of, knock that pin or even jarred or whatever, it's existentially threatening. So I think I understand why people do that. And so my balancing factor to that, and of course we know, not easily done, but worth the effort, is to always keep trying to help people grow in their understanding of things. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Donna. Great to hear from you. Yeah, it's I'm right there with you. And it's one of the things that Stephen Jay Gould, among others, talks about is evolution is not purposive per se. And it could care less whether we live a long, healthy, satisfied life. It's really just concerned with us reproducing. We have to live long enough to reproduce and raise the next generation to adulthood. And if we make it that far, that's good enough. And so, as has been noted, the 7 plus or minus 2 conscious registers we have to think with is pretty good when it comes to finding a banana and figuring out what to do with it. It's not nearly as good when it comes to trying to figure out how to manage a banana ecosystem so that there will be bananas 1,000 years from now. The level of complexity just blows up our brains. But when the problem is simpler, like run away from that tiger, we're pretty good. Our adrenaline kicks in, and we might have been playing with Pokemon cards and endlessly arguing about which Pokemon is the best. But the moment the tiger appears, most people are pretty good with that surge of adrenaline on suddenly changing focus and doing something vaguely right. So it is as though the one way to express this is that in a world with a lot of nature and a few human beings, we're going to do pretty well. There's a lot of banana trees. There's a lot of salmon. There's a lot of berries. There's stuff around to work with. but the less nature there is, and the more of us there is, the less well we do, because now we don't have the shock absorber of nature. We can't just say, "This city-state sucks. I'm going to go out into the wilderness and pick berries and fish for salmon," because we killed the wilderness. It doesn't have anywhere near the carrying capacity it used to have. It's like Donald was saying at the beginning of this call, all over the Pacific Northwest, we're desperately trying to rebuild our salmon runs because we've overfished. And when the Salish were running things in Puget Sound, they had fish coming out of their ears because they managed them that way. They've been here long enough to figure out we have to manage nature to produce an overabundance of everything. And that way, there's always enough to go around. And if my village sucks, I can leave and go set up a village somewhere else, and it's fine because there'll be some other stream that's got salmon running in it. But our approach in modern civilization is to exploit everything to the maximum to get as much short-term benefit as we can out of it. And then the consequence is the carrying capacity of nature diminishes, and the amount of nature there is diminishes as we pave it all over. And next thing you know, we're in a situation where if our village sucks, there's nowhere to go that isn't just another sucky village. It gets harder and harder and harder to find some place where you could set up a new town that isn't just destroying the one and only refuge of a butterfly that we've killed almost to extinction. It's like we've managed to stress the carrying capacity of the planet to such a degree that the defects in our thinking are starting to become existential threats. Wasn't an existential threats when there was so much food and wilderness around, but now that there's so much less of it, and we're dealing with these very complicated relationships with billions of people, we're overtaxing our conscious mind and what we evolved to be able to handle. It's a problem. It's a problem. And you're right, it comes down to survival, and the thing about evolution is it's perfectly happy driving species to extinction if they don't make the cut. So there's like no guarantee for us if we don't get our crap together and figure out how to do a better job with this, we might not be around. Which is one of the reasons I like existentialist philosophy. It says, you know what? Let's take that problem seriously. Let's do better. We need to do better. All right, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to try and weave a couple of narratives together. I was really like Donna getting into the neuroscience and then swinging around to this idea of we need a cohesive narrative of self, essentially what we call identity. And then this takes me back to what we were talking about before, this strangeness of attaching yourself to certain knowledge and not being able to update it. And we've talked about this before a number of times, but I'm just going to review this idea that like that's the way power works. Power attaches itself to a specific set of knowledge, and that it banks on that. And then once that model of the world is not correct, it can't adapt because then it would be releasing its power. So if it wants to stay powerful, then it has to be in charge of the vehicle. But once the vehicle is no longer getting you where you need to go, we need a new vehicle. Well, you're not going to be in charge of the next vehicle. So there's this idea that the power wants to hold on as long as possible, and then it breaks. You were talking about like the Copernican turn. I'm thinking I'm going to be doing this as much as I can. I'm going to be bringing Phil with us, even if he's not here around. I don't know where he is, but Phil would always talk about the Copernican turn and talk about this shift that essentially that it proved that the Catholic Church did not know what it was doing, and that they don't have the all-knowing eye, and therefore they're not the embodiment of power because they're not the one with the secret about the all-knowing eye. My other thing is Rabbi Sachs talks about this a lot, that in the ancient world, probably in the temple state, there was a really nice marrying between these ideas. He's never talked about this, but I think it really relates that in this time, in the temple state, there's usually a priest class that's separated, whatever. They're always like this, and they're the sacred, so to speak. And there's a hierarchy there that essentially that there's a top guy. But in a lot of these societies, especially like in Egypt, you have a pharaoh who is the god. He is the embodiment of that, and he literally is a god. He's not there's no this metaphor thing or symbolism. No, he is the physical God, and this is where essentially how divinity interacts with humanity. That it picks one special guy, and that guy is then like the divine right of kings. He's the one who's supposed to be God's image on earth. And then I'll come along essentially the Jewish or the Jesus idea that everybody is in the image of God and not just this one guy. And you see this also in the Assyrian and the Akkadian. All of these, they have this sort of like king like God person. And that usually is a real king that wears that mantle. I didn't do my research on this. I could for next time to mention this a little better, but that's like the ancient world. And then it seems like that also is how you validate empire. And you also have this in the ancient Chinese areas too, that essentially the reason that Yuval Harari talks specifically in a different angle, but essentially the reason China didn't do better than the West, even though it had great sources of power like gunpowder and navigation and all these things, they weren't interested in exploring because unknown things were always the source of ignorance, and then ignorance is the death of one's dynasty. If you are not the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful being that represents the link between God and man, almost like the Pope, and you don't have everything, well, everyone's investing in you as the emperor because you're that special guy and you have to know everything. To admit or at least even embrace this idea of ignorance immediately ruins all the certainty. And this goes specifically to Donna's idea that this is how we predicted certainty. He was the linchpin. This king or this top of the hierarchy also represented the link between man and God. That if that guy was not reliable, then everything else, all the dominoes underneath, come tumbling down. And so it's interesting that changed specifically in the West. There's this idea around science and the post-Copernican turn. There was an embrace of ignorance, something between empire. Instead of empire hating ignorance, empires thought that there was all of this low-hanging fruit out there that we could get through accepting our ignorance, and we'll go and grab it, and it will be really powerful. And you see for a long time, Yuval Harari talks about this in *Sapiens*, but his other books too, talks about how there were these military expeditions that they always sent their scientists on. You see this with the Spanish, and this is literally Darwin is on one of these things, right? And so you have this marriage between empire and science. But that's because they embrace uncertainty, which is a totally youthful attitude. If you look at this from old people or young people, old people have power in the hierarchies, but they're ossified. They're locked into a narrative. They're locked into a model of power structure. And if that doesn't work, they lose their power. So then they want everybody to just believe in that model until the model breaks so bad that it can't work anymore. It's almost like a vehicle. I think of an old jalopy. Everybody get on it. It's going to take you where you need to go. We're going to get to the store. It's going to be great. And then it doesn't get you to the store. You're like, oh, well, we need something else to get me to the store. And I think this is also an interesting model that we've thought of nature as kind of these providing these cars to get us to the store. But now we've sort of stressed nature so much that the car we're in, we got to fix it. We can't just dump it and get a new car because we can't go to the next village and just that village is better. Like, no, we kind of degraded all of environment. All of the vehicle is kind of hurting. So, but I wanted to point out specifically to tie this all with a soft landing, this idea of the embrace of ignorance. And specifically, we've talked about this before, that interesting, the Catholic Church, their death knell seems to me this inability to integrate new knowledge because they're married to an old, outdated model. And I would say the same thing in my own religion, that there's a lot of problems with it because there's certain marriage between power and models that's unwilling to like sort of embrace certain aspects of reality that are kind of what we'd call facts. Like the center of the earth, the center of the solar system is the sun, that kind of stuff. Like you can't deny reality. And as a philosophy, it's supposed to be, at least in my religion, I feel like in all of our societies, there's a tenet to embrace truth. But and science does this too. There's supposed to be seeking out the hypothesis that's going to break your current hypothesis. But most of the psychology is actually avoiding this. It's avoiding it and writing the model as possible you can. And that's because it provides fruit. But when the fruit is no longer coming and you have to look for higher and higher fruit, well, maybe there's lower hanging fruit elsewhere that I can grab. I think that's the equation. But it's also then even scarier that when then the whole, like you said, the breaks the brain is then, well, we're breaking the system that provides the new low hanging fruit, right? We're no longer able to go to a new tree and just grab some new hanging fruit. We have to really go back to formula kind of thing with humans. So I think that's why I'm interested in this talk so much and why I come every week, because our end of our epoch is like apparent to most people, and also like people are really in a lot of pain about it. They're like really suffering. Kind of wonder this question in the Roman era, in the medieval era, how long, like as a preemptive, did people have smell what was cooking, right? How many people were prophets where like they all saw the end coming, right? I feel like we're all saying that it doesn't have to be the end, but it's the end of what we're used to, is a good way of putting it. Right. So I think that's enough. But I really like the way Donna is marrying this to certainty, and then it relates it to power structures. And then like again, coming back to all this is like seems to be all over the place in different. I feel like every angle it comes back to in neuroscience is we have to have the courage to live with uncertainty. That's it. Thank you. All right, that's it. I'm done.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, that's fantastic. I over prepared for today. I had so much stuff that I could talk about the history, and I'm going to save some of it for next week. But because I want to do at least 8 minutes of Kenneth Smith before the end. I've done all the set it and the framing, and now we're about out of time. But as a preview for next week, I did a bunch of research, and I have literally nothing new to tell Ari in this area. But I did a bunch of research on Jewish history, and I learned some basics for the first time in my life about
I disagree. I'm sure you're going to teach me things that I don't know. This is my tenet of always everyone is smarter than me because they know things that I don't know. And that was a big mistake to think that I know, which I don't know anything, right? So you're going to teach me some stuff. I'm looking forward.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I suspect what will happen is I'll give a basic outline of some things that you already knew, and then you can enrich the discussion with things that you know about it. But the gist is I got walked through a history of Judaism from the return from the Babylonian captivity up through the destruction of the Second Temple, and it really sets the stage to understand the other half of what everybody's thinking about in Galilee and Samaria and Judea and Idumea during the same time. So it again really informs what the early Christian communities would have been like, and what the kind of late Second Temple Jewish communities were like, what was on their minds. But first, let's do a little bit more Kenneth Smith here before the end. And now that we've set a bunch more context for him, so the paragraph that we ended with last time, paragraph 18, the last sentence was, these twinned ideas of eternal reward and punishment are meant to redesign religion for the sake of those douloi, the appetite of experiential parochial slaves, driven not by what is right in itself, but by their own appetites, purportedly to modulate those appetites from natural to spiritual. These venal ideas indeed got modified further by late medieval Catholic indulgences, so as to reduce the terms of the afterlife to a commodity in a transaction for the sake of the banausoi, and that's the abstractivizing, intellectualizing craftsmen slaves, the ones slaves to ideology and training. Those who know no value but exchange value. That was where we ended up. And so this was, he's finishing up paragraph 18, talking about this idea of, Jesus preached these ideas that required you to really challenge your own beliefs and ideas, and to challenge society's beliefs and ideas. But the challenge, the difficulty for the emerging church by the second and third and fourth centuries is that they're growing, they're gaining power, and they're starting to get close to the empire, and they might be able to convert the Roman Empire. But to do that, they have to make themselves more attractive. They have to make themselves attractive to the empire, and they have to make themselves attractive to the kinds of people that Jesus basically said we're never going to get the message. The ones who he said, some towns you're just going to have to shake the dust of that town off your sandals and move on. So there's ground that cannot be fertilized. There are people who cannot hear this message. This is only for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. But that core tenet of Jesus's ran into direct conflict with the goal of the 4th century church, which was to expand as widely as possible and appeal to an entire empire. And so Kenneth's argument here is, they really just decided to put Jesus's teachings in the back seat and put in the front seat, how can we most motivate these two different kinds of slaves? The Romans inherited the Greek idea that people, regardless of whether they were a slave politically or economically, that there were people who were slaves by character. And in an unjust society, they might be ruling your society. But there's people who are so appetitive and parochial that they're not capable of thinking clearly about what other people need. And they're not capable of thinking about their own best needs independent of their own appetites and experiences. So those are the douloi. And on the other hand, you've got the banausoi, for whom everything is a transaction. People aren't even real to them. They're just potential pots of money or skill sets they might hire for a job. Everything has become abstracted for its use value. And you can't trust people like that to understand the values of health and vitality that a civilization or a people needs in order to endure. And so the Greeks believed only the people who had overcome those two twin traps of the mind ought to be governing. And the Romans inherited this. They didn't really believe it. They were, mafia gangster empire, but that was their branding, that the emperor was the Aristos, and the people around him were the other Aristoi, that they had the best character. And so that was what the church decided to appeal to in order to try to win those people over. All right, so let's go into paragraph 19. We have a few minutes. We could do this. He begins, in spite of its ostensible ethic of self-sacrifice, Christianity spread by appealing to such a self-interestedness, too self-obscure and pathetic to see itself for what it is. Now, when he says pathetic, for anyone who's new to these calls, he's not talking about bad. He's not insulting. He's talking about pathos. And pathos is where your agency is diminished. Your free expression of a capacity to reason critically about the world and yourself is diminished. And instead, you're mostly a victim of contingency. What have you been exposed to? What has somebody told you lately? You're the flotsam and jetsam of the forces of history. And he's putting that hand in hand with self-obscure. If you don't know yourself, then you don't know what your weaknesses are and you don't know what to compensate for. It's like being an alcoholic and not knowing it. You'll make the worst decisions. Says, being an alcoholic is one thing, but if you know yourself, you can compensate for that weakness. But if you don't know yourself, if you're self-obscure, you're not. So a self-interestedness that doesn't know itself, and as a result is a victim of the things that manipulate it, the tides of history, and so on. To capture this fundamentally self-interested soul, the organized church orchestrated a vengeful God, the fires of Gehenna, right, to scare people through transactionally into doing what you want. He says some writers have argued it was the subterranean smoldering pits beneath ancient Rome that impressed Christians with the possibility of a hell and the awful eternity of a tortured soul. So this is his critique of the kind of corruption of the spirituality. Yeah, easily manipulated. Yeah, exactly. He wraps up paragraph 19 as follows. But purely in concept, how can utterly active spirit be made to suffer? That is to say, this notion of a hell is a problem, because if the medieval worldview is supposed to be the regime of spirit, spirit is infinitizing in a way that the body is not. It's supposed to be capable of handling crises and learning things that you wouldn't have been able to predict in advance. It's not, there's more to it than just a simple, billiard ball mechanical model of the cosmos. So how can you make it suffer? Why can't it grow and dilate to handle that situation? There's he's saying there's a corruption of the very concept of spirit implicit in the idea that your soul is going to be tortured for eternity. He says, in such a notion, Christian theology had betrayed its very central idea. Body alone is passive matter, subject to pain and torture. Disembodied spirit cannot feel external afflictions, for spirit is by its very nature, by its very notion, what is most godlike and sovereign in us. And so that's his paragraph 19, critiquing the contradiction in the notion that your soul will be tortured for eternity, so you should do what we say. Because on the one hand, it destroys what ought to be the spiritual appeal to doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, because it leads to the right outcomes. And instead it replaces it with this transactional notion, do it or God will hurt you. And he says that is, the opposite of spirituality. But even if that wasn't a problem, it's corrupting the very concept of spirit itself to focus on hell, because it's suggesting that your spirit is just essentially another kind of ethereal body, and it's just as passive as your body is, just as subject to contingency as your body is. And no one has believed that for thousands of years. No one believed that about the spirit. The spirit was the opposite of that. So this is what he's saying. That's how deep they were willing to go into compromising the spiritual theology of their core framework in order to try to become an imperial religion instead of a personal one. And we'll pick up with the rest of it next week, and we'll do a bit of Jewish history. But we're getting into some good stuff about that. The very transition Sharon was asking about. How does it change from one to the other? Take care, Ginny. Good to see you. So I hope you all had a good time. I certainly enjoy these discussions, and I'm glad you came to hang out with us for this holiday Monday. And we'll
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. We'll see you next Monday.
Happy New Year, everyone.
We'll
Thanks
see you
for
next
hosting.
year. See you next year.